For years, my husband's family treated my 6-year-old daughter like she did not belong, humiliating her at every gathering. I stayed silent, playing the part of the modest wife, keeping my true background a closely guarded secret. Until one shocking night when they crossed the ultimate line at a lavish banquet and my billionaire parents unexpectedly arrived. What happened next left everyone speechless and turned my in-laws' entire world upside down. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Maya. I am 32 years old, and I am the sole heir to the Sterling family, an old money real estate and media empire in Atlanta. But to my husband's family, I was just an ordinary director of a small nonprofit organization. They had absolutely no idea about my family's wealth. It was a Saturday evening, and the grand ballroom of the most exclusive country club in the city was dripping in forced extravagance. The occasion was my mother-in-law, Beatrice's 60th birthday party. She had spent over $50,000 on this single night, maxing out credit cards and taking out personal loans just to invite Atlanta's social climbers and pretend she was part of the elite. Beatrice was the ultimate definition of fake bougie. She and her daughter, my sister-in-law Tasha, were obsessed with flashy designer logos, leased luxury cars, and making sure everyone knew exactly how much they spent on their shoes. I was raised with this concept of stealth wealth. My parents, Richard and Vivian Sterling, taught me that true power whispers, while insecurity screams. I wore unbranded, custom-tailored garments that cost more than Tasha's entire leased wardrobe, but because my clothes did not have massive logos plastered across the chest, my in-laws assumed I bought them at discount stores. I never corrected them. I wanted a husband who loved me, not for my family's trust fund. Andre, my husband, was a mid-level manager at a financial firm. I thought he was a good man when we met, but over the years his desperate need for his mother's approval had turned him into a weak, status-obsessed shell of the man I married. I was standing near the towering champagne fountain when the nightmare began. My sweet 6-year-old daughter Zuri was clutching a small, carefully wrapped box. She had spent 3 entire weeks working on this gift for her grandmother. It was a wooden jewelry box that she had sanded, painted by hand, and decorated with dried flowers from our garden. She was so incredibly proud of it. Zuri tugged on my dress, her big brown eyes shining with innocent excitement, asking if it was time to give her grandmother the present. I smiled, took her small hand in mine, and we walked toward the center of the room where Beatrice was holding court with her friends. Before we could even reach Beatrice, Tasha intercepted us. Tasha was wearing a skin-tight sequined gown that looked entirely inappropriate for a family gathering reeking of heavy designer perfume. She looked down at Zuri with an expression of pure disgust. Without a word of warning, Tasha snatched the small handmade box right out of my daughter's hands. "What is this?" Tasha asked, her voice deliberately loud so the surrounding guests would stop and look. She held the beautiful little box by its corner, dangling it in the air, as if it were a piece of garbage she had found on the bottom of her shoe. "It is for Grandma," Zuri said, her voice trembling slightly at her aunt's harsh tone. "I made it myself." Tasha let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed over the soft jazz music playing in the background. "You made it yourself, obviously." She tossed the box onto a nearby cocktail table. The wooden corner chipped against the marble surface, and I felt a hot spike of anger ignite in my chest. "This is a $50,000 black tie event," Maya, Tasha said. "We have important investors and local celebrities here tonight. Why would you let your child bring a cheap arts and crafts project to an elegant party like this?" I took a deep breath, trying to maintain the calm, collected demeanor my parents had instilled in me. "Tasha, it is a heartfelt gift from her only granddaughter. The value of a gift comes from the love put into it, not the price tag." Tasha rolled her eyes, her heavily contoured face twisting into a sneer. She stepped closer, her gaze dragging up and down my daughter's outfit. I had dressed Zuri in a beautiful hand-stitched linen dress, made from sustainable materials by an independent designer in Europe. It was elegant, comfortable, and age-appropriate. Well, speaking of price tags, Tasha said, raising her voice even louder. A circle of Beatrice's social climbing friends had now stopped talking to watch the spectacle. Could you not afford to buy her a decent dress for once? She looks like a homeless child. This dress looks like thrift store trash. Did you fish it out of a bargain bin? The cruelty in her words was intentional and calculated. Tasha knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted to humiliate me, but she was using a 6-year-old child to do it. Zuri looked down at her dress, her lower lip quivering. She was smart enough to understand that she was being ridiculed in front of dozens of strangers. Big, heavy tears welled up in her innocent eyes and began spilling down her cheeks. She reached out and grabbed my leg, hiding her face against my skirt, quietly sobbing. The sound of my daughter crying shattered the last remaining ounce of my patience. The polite, modest wife persona I had played for 6 years vanished in an instant. I stepped in front of Zuri, shielding her from Tasha's toxic glare. I closed the distance between my sister-in-law and myself, my posture shifting from relaxed to commanding. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I did. True authority does not require screaming. Do not ever speak to my daughter like that again, I said, my voice dropping to an icy, dangerous tone that made Tasha take a slight step backward. Her dress is a custom piece, but even if it were from a thrift store, it would not excuse your absolute lack of class. You are a 30-year-old woman bullying a 6-year-old child because you are too insecure to realize that all the designer labels in the world cannot cover up an ugly personality. The surrounding guests gasped. A few women whispered behind their hands. Tasha's face turned deep red, a mixture of profound embarrassment and furious rage. She was not used to me fighting back. For years I had swallowed their passive-aggressive comments to keep the peace for Andre's sake. But attacking my child was the absolute final line. "Excuse me," Tasha sputtered, her voice shrill and defensive. "How dare you speak to me like that at my mother's party? You are just a nobody running some tiny charity. You bring your brat here in rags and try to ruin our night." "I am not ruining anything," I replied, maintaining unbroken eye contact. "You are embarrassing yourself. Now, you are going to apologize to Zuri for throwing her gift and insulting her." "I will do no such thing," Tasha snapped, crossing her arms defensively. The atmosphere in this room had grown incredibly tense. The string quartet in the corner seemed to play softer as the confrontation drew more attention. I stood my ground, my arm wrapped protectively around Zuri's trembling shoulders. As I held Zuri close, I could smell the overpowering scent of the expensive floral arrangements Beatrice had ordered. White lilies and orchids that cost more than my husband's monthly salary. The entire room was a monument to financial irresponsibility. I knew for a fact that Beatrice had taken out a second mortgage on her modest suburban home just to rent this ballroom. She had hired a local public relations firm to ensure photographers were present, hoping to get her picture in an Atlanta lifestyle magazine. The desperation for status radiated from every corner of the venue. Tasha stood before me, breathing heavily, her fake eyelashes fluttering as she glared at me. She was wearing a massive, flashy diamond necklace that I recognized immediately as a cubic zirconia replica of a famous Cartier piece. It was the perfect metaphor for their entire family, bright and shiny on the outside, but completely fake and worthless upon closer inspection. "You are so arrogant," Tasha hissed, leaning in closer so only I and the immediate circle of guests could hear. "You walk around here acting like you are better than us, but you are nothing. My brother could have married anyone, a doctor, a lawyer, a woman with actual connections. Instead, he settled for you. And now we all have to suffer the embarrassment of having you drag down our family image." I looked at her replica necklace, then down at my own simple, unbranded watch, a rare vintage Patek Philippe passed down from my grandfather, worth more than Tasha's entire life savings. I felt a cold, bitter smile touch my lips. "Your family image," I repeated softly. "That is all that matters to you, is it not? An image. A fragile, paper-thin illusion." Zuri whimpered against my leg, clutching the fabric of my skirt tightly in her small fists. I gently stroked her braided hair, trying to soothe her silent sobs. My heart broke for my little girl. She did not understand the vicious social games these adults were playing. She only understood that her aunt hated her gift and called her ugly. I promised myself right then and there that I would never let anyone make her feel small again, not even her own father's family. The tension in the ballroom had reached a boiling point. The whispers among the elite guests grew louder. They were not admiring Beatrice's expensive party anymore. They were watching a family tear itself apart in the middle of the dance floor. I stood tall, radiating the quiet, unyielding power of the sterling legacy, ready for whatever came next. I kept my eyes locked on Tasha, refusing to back down. The heavy crystal chandeliers above us cast a bright, unforgiving light on her flushed face. I could see the exact moment she realized she could not intimidate me. But unfortunately, her realization did not bring an end to the cruelty. It only signaled the beginning of a much larger nightmare. I knew Andre was watching from the bar with Darius. I knew he saw our daughter crying. And I knew deep down that the real conflict was only just beginning. The night was still young, and the true depths of this family's toxic nature were about to be revealed. I held Zuri closer to my side, bracing myself for the storm. Andre pushed his way through the crowd of whispering guests, his heavy footsteps thudding against the polished marble floor. His face was flushed a deep, angry red, and a thick vein throbbed visibly at his right temple. For a fleeting fraction of a second, the naive, hopeful part of my heart thought my husband was rushing over to aggressively defend his crying daughter. I wanted to believe he had seen Tasha maliciously snatch the handmade gift out of Zuri's tiny hands and was storming over to demand a swift public apology from his sister. Instead, he reached out and grabbed my upper arm with a harsh, unyielding grip. He dragged me a few steps away from the gathering circle of socialites, forcing a terrified Zuri to stumble along with me in her beautiful linen dress. "What exactly is wrong with you?" Andre hissed, his voice a furious, venomous whisper that cut through the soft jazz playing in the background. I just secured 5 uninterrupted minutes with Darius's lead investor. I was finally making progress, and instead of successfully pitching my financial portfolio, I am rushing over here to stop my wife from throwing a massive tantrum on the dance floor. "Are you intentionally trying to ruin my career?" I stared at the man I had married 6 years ago, feeling a cold wave of revulsion wash over my entire body. He was wearing a rented tuxedo that was slightly too tight across the shoulders, sweating profusely under the blazing ballroom chandeliers. He did not even bother to glance down at his 6-year-old daughter, who was still wiping silent, devastating tears from her soft cheeks. "Your sister just publicly humiliated your only child," I said, my voice dangerously level and devoid of any warmth. She called Zuri ugly and threw her handmade gift onto a cocktail table like it was worthless garbage. "And your very first concern is a brief conversation with a random investor." Andre ran a frustrated, shaking hand over his sweaty face, leaving a smudge on his forehead. "You know exactly how Tasha is. She is blunt. She has high standards for fashion. You cannot just snap at her like a lunatic in the middle of my mother's extravagant birthday celebration. Look around Maya. Half the country club board of directors is watching us right now, judging every move we make. Darius specifically promised he would put in a good word for my senior promotion if tonight goes smoothly. You are actively embarrassing me in front of people who actually matter." The phrase "people who actually matter" struck me like a physical blow to the chest. To Andre, the superficial, fleeting approval of Darius and a room full of pretentious strangers held exponentially more weight than the emotional well-being of his own flesh and blood. I slowly turned my head to look over at Darius, who was standing confidently by the open bar, swirling a heavy glass of expensive scotch and smirking in our direction. Darius was a self-proclaimed finance guru who drove a leased Lamborghini and constantly bragged loudly about his massive anonymous venture capital backing. I knew for an absolute undeniable fact that the $2 million fund he was so arrogantly proud of was merely a minor subsidiary of the Sterling family trust, my family's trust. But to Andre, Darius was a living god, a glittering symbol of the immense wealth and elite status he so desperately craved but could never genuinely achieve. "She is just a kid," Maya Andre continued, completely missing the freezing, calculated realization settling deep in my eyes. "She will get over a few harsh words. But my reputation might not recover from this kind of public humiliation if Darius decides to cut me out of his exclusive professional network." You need to walk back over there and apologize to Tasha right now. Smooth this disaster over before my mother gets involved and makes it worse. I looked down at Zuri. She was gripping the soft fabric of my dress, her small, fragile body trembling with suppressed sobs. Then I looked back at Andre. The man who was supposed to be our ultimate protector had firmly chosen his side. He had cowardly chosen the fake hollow prestige of a leased lifestyle over his loyal wife and innocent daughter. I am not apologizing to anyone for defending my child, I said quietly, the finality in my tone causing him to blink in surprise. And if you had a single ounce of spine or integrity, you would be marching over there to demand an immediate apology for your weeping daughter. Andre's face contorted with pure, unadulterated anger. He pointed a shaking accusatory finger directly at my chest. You have always been exactly like this. Selfish. You have absolutely no ambition, no understanding of how the real corporate world works, and no respect for the hustle. We are trying to build a lasting family legacy here, and you are acting like a sensitive, ungrateful peasant. Before Andre could launch into another pathetic, misguided defense of his incredibly toxic sister, the crowd of onlookers parted once again. Beatrice swept onto the scene, her heavily sequined, outrageously gaudy gold gown catching the overhead light in the most garish way imaginable. She marched toward us with the furious, unstoppable energy of a desperate woman whose carefully curated social illusion was being directly threatened. Behind her trailed a young, heavily made-up woman holding a smartphone on a stabilizer gimbal, continuously recording the ballroom's opulence. It was a local social media influencer Beatrice had likely paid a small fortune to attend, desperately attempting to manufacture a false sense of elite exclusivity for her birthday bash. What is the meaning of this unacceptable disruption? Beatrice demanded, her sharp voice effortlessly cutting through the remaining ambient noise in the venue. I paid an exorbitant amount of money for a flawless, elegant evening, Maya. I certainly did not pay to have you create a ghetto dramatic spectacle in the middle of my high society country club debut. I stood perfectly still, my hand resting gently on Zuri's braided hair, offering silent comfort to my terrified child. Your daughter viciously attacked my child, Beatrice. I simply corrected her atrocious behavior since you clearly never bothered to do so during her childhood. Beatrice gasped dramatically, clutching a manicured hand to her chest as if she had been brutally and physically struck. Several of her wealthy friends murmured in loud agreement, shaking their heads in mock dismay at my sheer audacity. Tasha, who had quickly retreated to the safety of her mother's side, crossed her arms and glared at me with a triumphant, malicious smirk. You have completely ruined the sophisticated mood of my entire celebration, Beatrice declared, purposely raising her voice so the hired influencer's camera would capture her authoritative, commanding tone. I truly should have known better than to expect a woman of your low-class working background to understand how to conduct herself gracefully among high society. You lack basic grace, Maya. You severely lack refinement and pedigree. Andre quickly stepped forward, his head bowed in a pathetic display of absolute submission. Mom, I am so incredibly sorry. I just told her to apologize to Tasha. I am trying my hardest to handle this situation quietly. You are failing miserably, Andre Beatrice snapped, not even bothering to look at her groveling son. She turned her piercing judgmental gaze back to me. Since you clearly do not know how to behave properly among respectable wealthy people, I am making an immediate change to the seating arrangements. The lovely influencer here, Miss Chloe, desperately needs a prominent, visible place at the main family table so she can properly document the evening for her millions of followers. Her presence here adds actual tangible value to my event. I slowly looked over at the main family table situated at the very front of the room. It was draped in expensive imported silk and covered in towering, ridiculously massive floral centerpieces. My beautifully calligraphed place card and Zuri's matching place card were currently sitting right next to Andre's. You are actively taking away your own granddaughter's seat for an internet stranger, I asked, my tone utterly devoid of any recognizable emotion. I wanted to hear her say it clearly and loudly. I wanted absolutely no room for misinterpretation when the heavy hammer of justice finally fell on this family. Beatrice let out a harsh, patronizing laugh that grated on my nerves. Zuri is a small child who brings cheap wooden junk to a luxury gala event. She does not appreciate the expensive ambiance, and neither do you. You both severely bring down the aesthetic value of the main table. There is a small table by the swinging kitchen doors right next to the public restrooms. That is where the catering staff, the busboys, and the coat check attendants are sitting to eat during their scheduled breaks. You and your daughter can go sit back there. It is much more fitting for your particular pedigree. Andre finally looked up, a brief, cowardly flash of hesitation crossing his sweaty face. Mom making my wife and child sit by the kitchen doors with the hourly staff. Maybe that is going a bit too far. Darius's powerful investors might notice the absence and ask uncomfortable questions. Beatrice shot him a terrifying, silencing glare that immediately made him shrink back. The investors will notice that we know exactly how to prune the dead, useless weight from our successful family tree, Andre. If Maya cannot elevate our social status, she can sit quietly in the shadows where she truly belongs. Beatrice then leaned in uncomfortably close to me, her heavy, expensive perfume almost suffocating in its intensity. She lowered her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper, intending it only for my ears, ensuring the camera did not catch her true cruelty. Let me make this incredibly simple for your small mind to comprehend, Maya. Chickens cannot stand with peacocks. Now take your little girl and get out of my sight, before I have my security team throw you out into the street completely. A heavy, deafening silence fell over our small, tense circle. Tasha smirked, feeling completely victorious. Andre looked down at his rented shoes, thoroughly defeated and eagerly compliant. Beatrice stood tall, completely convinced of her own supreme, unchallenged victory. They truly thought they had won. They thought they had successfully asserted their absolute dominance over a weak, poor woman who had absolutely no choice but to swallow their endless abuse. I looked at my arrogant mother-in-law. I looked at the cheap, flashy cubic zirconia sparkling brightly on Tasha's neck. I looked at the rented tuxedo straining across my husband's cowardly back. And then I smiled. It was a terrifyingly calm, collected smile, the exact kind of smile my billionaire father, Richard Sterling, reliably used right before he initiated a ruthless, hostile corporate takeover. You are absolutely right, Beatrice, I said, my voice as smooth and unbreakable as tempered glass. We would not dream of ruining your carefully crafted aesthetic for a single second longer. Come, Zuri. We are going to go sit by the kitchen doors. I did not wait for a single response from any of them. I turned my back on the entire toxic group, took my daughter's small hand securely in mine, and walked away with absolute, unshakable dignity. I did not rush my steps, and I absolutely did not look back. Every single step I took toward the shadows at the back of the room was meticulously calculated. They had arrogantly demanded I sit in the dark, completely unaware that I was about to plunge their entire fake, glittering world into absolute, irreversible ruin. Walking to the back of the ballroom felt like crossing an invisible border between two worlds. We left the fragrant scent of imported orchids and the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, stepping into the drafty corridor next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. Waiters rushed past carrying heavy silver trays, shouting orders. The staff table was completely bare. There was no silk tablecloth, no polished silverware, and certainly no extravagant floral centerpieces. It was a simple folding table meant for tired busboys to rest their feet during 10-minute breaks. I pulled out a rigid metal chair and lifted Zuri onto it, smoothing down the soft linen of her dress. A young woman wearing the black uniform sat at the far end of the table. She looked up with profound confusion, her eyes darting between my elegant gown and the glittering crowd. She knew immediately that we did not belong back here, but she wisely kept her mouth shut. I focused entirely on my daughter. Zuri had stopped crying, but her small shoulders still hitched. "Mommy, I am hungry," Zuri whispered, her small hands rubbing her stomach. "Can we have some bread now?" My heart ached with a fierce, protective intensity. We had arrived 2 hours early at Beatrice's strict demand, meaning Zuri had not eaten since lunch. I gently flagged down a passing waiter holding a pitcher of ice water. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice polite and even. "Could we please get some bread for my daughter? She is quite hungry." The waiter stopped and looked at us. He took a step forward, but then froze. His eyes flicked toward Beatrice, who was laughing loudly with her friends. He swallowed hard and looked back at me with deep, genuine apology in his eyes. "I am so sorry, ma'am," the waiter stammered, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot. The event hostess, the older woman in the gold dress, gave our catering captain very specific, strict instructions regarding this table. She explicitly stated that the staff seating area is absolutely not to be served any food or beverages until after the main guests have completely finished their 5-course meal. She said it would disrupt the aesthetic flow of the dining service. I felt the blood run cold in my veins. Beatrice had actually instructed the catering staff to withhold food from a 6-year-old child. It was not enough for her to publicly humiliate us and banish us to the shadows. She wanted to enforce a physical punishment to make us truly feel like second-class citizens begging for table scraps. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of starving her own granddaughter just to prove a petty social point was staggering. The waiter looked miserable, clearly torn between his basic human decency and the threat of losing his job. I offered him a reassuring nod, refusing to shoot the messenger. "I understand," I told him calmly. "You are just doing your job. Do not worry about it." He hurried away, looking immensely relieved. I turned back to Zuri, who was looking up at me with large, confused brown eyes. I reached out and gently cupped her cheek, my thumb brushing away a dried tear. "Just wait a little longer, my sweet girl," I promised her, my voice thick with a silent, dangerous promise. "Mommy is going to get you the best meal of your entire life very, very soon. Nobody is going to treat you like this ever again." I sat back in my rigid metal chair, wrapping my arms protectively around her small frame. I watched the glittering crowd at the front of the room, my mind shifting gears from a patient, accommodating wife into the ruthless, calculating, sterling heir I was born to be. The patience I had nurtured for 6 long years was finally dead. Through the swinging kitchen doors, the tantalizing aroma of roasted tenderloin and truffle mashed potatoes drifted into our dark corner. Zuri rested her head against my arm, trying to be brave, but her stomach let out a soft, audible rumble. At that exact moment, I saw Andre walking away from the main family table. He was heading straight toward the premium open bar, which was situated just a few yards away from our isolated staff table. Zuri saw him too. Her eyes immediately lit up with innocent hope. "Daddy," she called out, her voice sweet and clear, cutting through the background chatter. "Daddy, we are over here." Andre stopped dead in his tracks. He was less than 20 feet away from us. He slowly turned his head, making direct, unbroken eye contact with me. I watched his gaze drop down to his hungry daughter, who was giving him a small, eager wave. For a split second, I waited for the fatherly instinct to kick in. I waited for him to walk over, pick up his child, demand a plate of food from the kitchen, and march us right out of this toxic environment. Instead, Andre visibly cringed. He looked around frantically, his eyes darting back and forth to see if any of the wealthy, influential guests had noticed his daughter sitting by the trash bins. When he realized nobody was paying attention to us, he did the unthinkable. He turned his back on us. He completely ignored his daughter's call, squared his shoulders, and walked briskly over to the bar to join Darius, pretending we simply did not exist. Zuri slowly lowered her hand, her bright expression faltering into deep confusion. "Why is Daddy not coming over, Mommy?" she asked quietly. "Because Daddy is busy making his choices," I replied. My voice steady, though a blazing inferno of rage was actively consuming my heart. At the bar, Darius was holding court. He had gathered a large circle of impressionable guests and aspiring entrepreneurs around him. He was speaking incredibly loudly, ensuring his voice carried across the room and right into my dark corner. He held a glass of expensive bourbon in one hand and casually draped his other arm over Andre's shoulder in a patronizing display of dominance. "I am telling you, Andre, you just have to project absolute dominance," Darius boasted, laughing heartily. "The financial sector is all about making the big players respect you. You have to force them to open their wallets. Look at my firm. I just closed a massive $2 million seed funding round this morning, $2 million cash directly into our accounts." The guests surrounding him murmured in awe. Andre nodded eagerly, looking at his brother-in-law with embarrassing reverence. "That is incredible, Darius!" Andre said, his voice loud enough for me to hear. Who is the backer? Is it one of the major Wall Street players? Darius took a smug sip of his bourbon. It is an exclusive, highly secretive venture capital firm based out of Atlanta. Very old money. They remain strictly anonymous to the public, but let me tell you, they practically begged to give me the capital. They reviewed my investment portfolio, saw my visionary market projections, and realized I am the next big thing in the Southern Financial District. They are desperate to get on the ground floor of my empire. I sat in the shadows by the kitchen doors, listening to this arrogant, posturing clown, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. Darius was bragging about his brilliant business acumen, completely oblivious to the real truth behind his newly acquired wealth. I knew exactly which anonymous venture capital firm he was talking about. It was Sterling Vanguard Holdings, a minor subsidiary trust fully owned and operated by my father. Darius's portfolio was a joke. It was a chaotic, high-risk mess built on shaky projections and borderline fraudulent accounting practices. Every legitimate bank had already rejected his loan applications. The only reason Sterling Vanguard Holdings had injected $2 million into his failing company was because I had personally called my father's network a month ago. I had quietly asked them to throw my brother-in-law a financial lifeline just to stop Tasha from complaining about their debts. Darius was standing there soaking up the admiration of Atlanta's social climbers, bragging about his self-made genius, completely unaware that he was surviving on my family's hidden charity. He was mocking my daughter's handmade dress while his entire fake luxurious lifestyle was being directly funded by the very woman he was forcing to sit by the restrooms. And Andre, my spineless, status-obsessed husband, was standing right beside him, worshipping a false idol built on my hidden wealth while leaving his real family to starve in the dark. The sheer unbelievable audacity of this ridiculous situation completely washed over me in waves of freezing clarity. I slowly looked at the foolish men laughing so arrogantly by the bar. I looked at Beatrice preening like a queen at the front table. I looked at Tasha dripping in rented fake diamonds. They truly believed they held all the power tonight. They were entirely, blissfully unaware of the absolute devastation heading their way. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with, but they were all about to find out the real truth very soon. Zuri shivered against my side. The hallway connecting the main ballroom to the catering kitchen was poorly insulated, and a cold draft swept continuously over our bare shoulders every time the heavy metal doors swung open. I took off my tailored blazer and wrapped it securely around her small, trembling frame. She buried her face into the warm fabric, her exhaustion finally overpowering her hunger as her heavy eyelids began to droop. I gently stroked her hair until her breathing steadied into the deep, rhythmic sleep of an innocent child who had cried herself to absolute exhaustion. With Zuri asleep, the protective maternal instinct that had driven me to shield her morphed into something entirely different. It hardened into a cold, unbreakable resolve. I looked down at my left hand. The diamond engagement ring and the matching wedding band Andre had proudly placed on my finger 6 years ago caught the dim, flickering light of the exit sign overhead. When he proposed, he told me I was his equal, his partner in everything. He promised to protect us. Tonight, he had shattered those vows into a million irreparable pieces for the sake of impressing a room full of superficial strangers. The marriage was completely dead. There was no argument left to be had, no counseling session that could repair the profound disgust I felt for the man laughing at the bar. I placed my right thumb and index finger over the rings. Without a single tear, without a fraction of hesitation, I slid both bands off my finger. They felt cold and heavy in my palm before I dropped them carelessly into the bottom of my purse. They were nothing but meaningless metal now. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my face in the shadows. I bypassed my usual contacts and accessed a secure encrypted communication app I rarely used. I dialed a number that went directly to the private desk of Richard Sterling. My father answered on the first ring. He did not say hello. He already knew who was calling on this specific secure line. Maya, his deep, resonant voice filled the earpiece, carrying the absolute authority of a man who commanded empires. Is everything all right? No. I replied, my voice a calm, lethal whisper. They crossed the line. They insulted Zuri, they starved her, and they banished us to the kitchen doors. Andre stood by and watched it happen. He chose them. A heavy, dangerous silence fell over the line. My father was not a man who yelled or threw tantrums like Beatrice or Tasha. When Richard Sterling was truly furious, the world simply went quiet before the devastation hit. "Are you and my granddaughter safe right now?" he asked, his tone dropping an octave. "We are physically safe," I confirmed. "But I am done playing the modest wife. I am done hiding who we are to protect their fragile, pathetic egos." I heard the faint rustle of papers on his end, followed by the distinctive click of a heavy fountain pen being set down on a mahogany desk. He had been working late managing the global operations of the Sterling Family Trust, but he was dropping everything for us. "What do you need me to do, Maya?" he asked. I looked out across the ballroom. Beatrice was waving a champagne flute in the air, cackling wildly at something the hired influencer said. Tasha was posing for photos showing off her rented jewelry. Andre and Darius were clinking glasses, toasting to their fake hollow success. "It is time," I said simply. "Bring the fire. We will be there in 20 minutes, my father promised. Start dismantling them from the inside." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The time for passive observation was over. I unzipped the hidden compartment of my tote bag and pulled out my sleek silver laptop. I set it down on the cold metal surface of the staff table, right next to the stacks of dirty plates the busboys had abandoned. I flipped the screen open, the bright white glow cutting through the dimness of our isolated corner. I connected to my personal encrypted hotspot and bypassed my standard nonprofit email account. Instead, I logged directly into the Sterling Family Executive Server. The interface loaded instantly, granting me top-tier administrative access to our global financial network. Through the swinging doors, I could hear the lively, booming sound of the band playing a celebratory jazz number. Laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses echoed across the venue. They were having the time of their lives, completely oblivious to the digital execution I was about to perform. I opened a new email draft. My first target was the arrogant, boastful man currently holding court at the bar. I typed in the address for the managing director of Sterling Vanguard Holdings. The subject line was brief and unforgiving: immediate termination of funding protocol. In the body of the email, I wrote exactly 2 sentences. Execute the immediate freeze on all capital transfers to Darius Vance's investment firm due to critical breach of ethics and suspected financial fraud. Initiate legal proceedings to recover the initial deposit and notify federal authorities of his falsified projections. I hit send. It took less than 3 seconds to financially annihilate Darius and destroy the fake empire he was using to belittle my daughter. He was currently throwing back another shot of premium bourbon, entirely oblivious to the fact that his bank accounts were actively freezing and his fraudulent business was collapsing into ruins. Next, I turned my attention to the man who had failed to protect us. Andre believed his recent promotion and his high-profile client list were the result of his own brilliant hustle. He had absolutely no idea that for the past 5 years the Sterling Network had been quietly funneling lucrative contracts to his firm, specifically requesting him as the account manager to ensure my husband felt successful and fulfilled. I had pulled countless strings in the shadows to build his confidence, wanting to see him thrive. Tonight, he took that confidence and used it to abandon his family. He bit the hand that secretly fed him, and now he was going to starve. I opened a second email, directing it to the senior partners at Andre's financial firm. They were men who answered directly to my father's wealth management division. The subject line read, "Severance of Sterling Accounts." I typed rapidly, my fingers flying across the keyboard with lethal precision. "Effective immediately, the Sterling Family Trust and all associated subsidiaries are withdrawing our portfolios from your firm. The only condition under which we will halt this massive capital withdrawal is the immediate, unconditional termination of Andre Vance." I hit send. Andre's career, built entirely on my hidden foundation, was officially over. The senior partners would panic the second that email hit their inboxes. Andre would be unemployed before the birthday cake was even sliced. I paused for a moment, looking over the top of my laptop screen. Beatrice was practically glowing, posing for the influencer's camera, bragging loudly about her exclusive membership to this highly restricted country club. She had leveraged her entire life savings and taken out a second mortgage to afford this single night of supreme arrogance. She truly believed she had arrived at the pinnacle of Atlanta society, mocking my daughter's clothing while drowning in insurmountable debt just to maintain a fragile illusion. I opened a third and final email. This one was addressed directly to the general manager of the resort and country club, a man whose paycheck was signed by a holding company my mother, Vivian Sterling, personally controlled. The subject line was simple: Code Red Venue Revocation. I typed out my final directive. As the majority shareholder of this property, I am ordering the immediate termination of Beatrice Vance's country club membership due to severe code of conduct violations and discriminatory behavior toward a minor. Furthermore, all complimentary services discounts and grace periods for tonight's event are revoked. Prepare the full, unadjusted invoice for $50,000 and present it to her immediately. Instruct your security team to prepare for an emergency venue shutdown. I hit send for the final time. The emails were out. The digital dominoes were falling. I closed my laptop with a soft, definitive click and slid it back into my bag. I leaned back in my rigid metal chair, wrapping my arms around my sleeping daughter, providing her the warmth and safety her father had callously denied her. I watched the golden, shimmering room full of terrible, superficial people. The music played on the champagne flowed in crystal flutes, and the laughter continued to ring out over the crowded dance floor. Tasha was twirling in her rented sequins. Andre was pathetically networking with men whose careers I could end with a single keystroke. Beatrice was soaking in the fake adoration of women who would abandon her the second they realized she was broke. They were entirely oblivious to the massive storm brewing just outside the heavy double doors of the ballroom. But the clock was ticking down on their miserable facade, and the executioners were already on their way. The lively jazz music slowly faded into a soft, instrumental hum as a booming voice echoed over the state-of-the-art sound system. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could please have your attention at the front of the ballroom. The majestic six-tier fondant cake, adorned with edible gold leaf and imported spun sugar roses, was being wheeled onto the center stage by four struggling waiters. Beatrice practically sprinted toward the spotlight, her gaudy gold dress catching every single lumen of the overhead chandeliers. She positioned herself right next to the massive confection, throwing her head back in a practiced theatrical laugh, as the hired social media influencer circled her like a hungry shark, capturing every angle for her online followers. Beatrice held up a massive, jewel-encrusted cake knife, waving it around as if she had just conquered a small nation. The crowd clapped politely, some cheering louder than others, entirely caught up in the performative luxury of the moment. Just as she was about to make the first dramatic slice into the vanilla buttercream, Darius stepped forward. He confidently bypassed his mother-in-law and snatched the sleek silver microphone right out of the event coordinator's hands. Darius adjusted his tailored jacket, shooting a blinding, artificially whitened smile out to the sea of wealthy guests. He tapped the microphone twice, the sharp thud echoing loudly across the expansive room. If I could just say a few words before the guest of honor cuts this incredible masterpiece. Darius began, his voice dripping with an arrogance so thick you could practically cut it with Beatrice's cake knife. We are all here tonight to celebrate a woman of immense class and undeniable vision. But looking around this room, seeing the movers and shakers of Atlanta's elite financial district, I am reminded of what it truly takes to reach this level of absolute supremacy. It takes hustle. It takes an uncompromising, relentless drive to crush the competition and build a legacy from scratch. He paused, letting his words wash over the audience, soaking in their undivided attention. Tasha was standing in the front row, cheering loudly for her husband, her rented cubic zirconia necklace practically blinding the people standing next to her. Darius puffed out his chest, completely addicted to the sound of his own voice. As many of you already know, my investment firm closed a monumental $2 million seed funding round just this morning. Darius boasted, raising his glass of premium bourbon high into the air. I did not inherit my wealth. I did not rely on handouts. I built my empire through late nights, aggressive market strategies, and a refusal to settle for mediocrity. The anonymous venture capital firm that backed me recognized a self-made alpha. They saw a man who understands that in this brutal corporate world, you either run with the wolves or you get eaten by them. And let me tell you, I am leading the pack. Andre stood just a few feet away, nodding vigorously in enthusiastic agreement, applauding his brother-in-law with pathetic, unwavering loyalty. Andre looked utterly mesmerized by Darius's fabricated tale of masculine dominance and financial brilliance. He was clapping so hard, his palms must have stung desperately, hoping some of that fake, unearned prestige would somehow magically rub off on him. Darius pointed directly at Andre, offering him a patronizing wink. My man Andre over there knows exactly what I am talking about. We are building generational wealth from the ground up. We are the new kings of this city. So here is to Beatrice for hosting a party fit for royalty, and here is to the self-made winners in this room who refuse to apologize for their success. The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause. Men in expensive suits raised their glasses in solidarity, completely fooled by the confident, charismatic con artist standing on the stage. Beatrice beamed with absolute pride, gesturing for the influencer to make sure Darius's speech was captured in high definition. Tasha blew her husband a dramatic kiss, practically vibrating with smug superiority. I sat in the cold shadows by the kitchen doors, holding my sleeping daughter, watching this spectacular circus of lies unfold. Darius was putting on the performance of a lifetime, boasting about running with wolves while actively bleeding money from my family's hidden charity. He was standing at the absolute peak of his imaginary mountain, completely high on his own fabricated glory. It was the most exquisite, satisfying form of dramatic irony. He had climbed so incredibly high on a ladder made of paper and deceit, which meant the impending fall was going to be nothing short of catastrophic. I gently stroked Zuri's back, my eyes fixed on the arrogant man holding the microphone. Enjoy the applause, Darius. I whispered into the cool, drafty air of the service hallway. It is the very last time anyone in this city will ever clap for you. Just as Darius lowered the microphone, preparing to hand it back to the event coordinator so Beatrice could finally cut her ridiculously expensive cake, the lavish ballroom underwent a sudden, violent transformation. The lively background jazz music did not just fade away, it was abruptly and aggressively cut off, severing the sophisticated ambiance in a single heartbeat. A harsh, deafening screech of electronic feedback tore through the state-of-the-art speakers, causing several wealthy guests in the front row to visibly flinch and cover their ears in sheer discomfort. Darius tapped the silver microphone frantically, his arrogant smirk instantly morphing into an expression of profound irritation. He blew into the metallic mesh, but it was completely dead. The entire audio system of the country club had been remotely and intentionally disabled. Before Beatrice could even open her mouth to loudly complain about the unacceptable technical difficulties ruining her flawless birthday presentation, the lighting shifted. The warm, golden, flattering glow of the imported crystal chandeliers was instantly killed. In their place, the venue's harsh, unforgiving, bright white emergency house lights slammed on, flooding every single corner of the expansive ballroom with a stark, sterile glare. It was as if a beautiful, glittering, theatrical curtain had been violently ripped down, exposing the cheap, ugly scaffolding hidden underneath. The luxurious, magical illusion Beatrice had desperately paid $50,000 to manufacture was completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. The sudden glaring brightness made Tasha's cubic zirconia necklace look cheap and cloudy. It highlighted the sweat stains forming on the back of Andre's overly tight rented tuxedo. It made the towering fondant cake look stiff and overly processed rather than elegant and majestic. A loud, confused murmur rapidly spread through the massive crowd of high society guests. Men in tailored suits exchanged uneasy, nervous glances, while women in designer gowns clutched their expensive handbags tightly against their chests. The collective atmosphere of the room instantly flipped from a relaxed, arrogant celebration to a state of tense, unpredictable chaos. Then the heavy, intricately carved mahogany doors at the main entrance of the ballroom burst wide open. The sudden noise echoed like a gunshot across the quiet, bewildered room. The venue's general manager, a usually composed and exceptionally polite man, who had spent the entire evening catering to Beatrice's every ridiculous whim, sprinted into the ballroom. His face was completely drained of color, pale and slick with panicked sweat. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting wildly around the room as if searching for an imminent threat. But he was not alone. Marching in perfect, terrifying unison, right behind the panicked manager, was a highly professional, profoundly menacing private security detail. There were exactly 12 men in total, all towering, broad-shouldered, and dressed in impeccably tailored pitch-black suits. They moved with a chilling, synchronized military precision that absolutely screamed unlimited corporate power. They did not shout, they did not run. They simply spread out in a rapid, highly tactical formation, physically blocking all the main exit doors and surrounding the perimeter of the ballroom in complete, terrifying silence. Their faces were carved from stone, completely devoid of any recognizable emotion, their hands resting neutrally but dangerously at their sides. The room fell into absolute suffocating silence. You could have heard a single pin drop on the marble floor. Darius lowered his useless microphone, his fake alpha male confidence evaporating into thin air. Beatrice stood frozen next to her extravagant cake, the massive jeweled knife trembling slightly in her manicured hand. Andre took a cautious, cowardly step backward, hiding slightly behind his mother's gold-sequined dress. The elite socialites of Atlanta stood perfectly still, their collective breath caught in their throats, realizing instantly that whoever these men worked for possessed a level of absolute authority that none of them could even begin to fathom. I sat comfortably in the shadows, holding my sleeping daughter, watching the flawless, devastating execution of my father's absolute power. The massive steel trap was perfectly set, the heavy mahogany doors were fully locked, and there was absolutely no escape for any of them. The reckoning had finally arrived. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance, previously guarded by the imposing security detail, were slowly pushed open by two men in dark suits. The squeak of the brass hinges sounded like a prolonged scream in the dead silence of the ballroom. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of terrified socialites as two powerful, intimidating figures stepped across the heavy threshold and into the stark, unforgiving, bright glare of the emergency house lights, casting long shadows across the floor. It was my parents. Richard and Vivian Sterling had finally arrived. They did not walk into the room. They commandeered it. The sheer gravitational weight of their presence instantly sucked the oxygen out of the massive space. My father, Richard Sterling, was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 60s. He wore a bespoke charcoal gray suit tailored on Savile Row, perfectly cut to his commanding frame. There were no flashy watches on his wrist, no shiny designer belt buckles, and absolutely no logos anywhere on his person. His wealth was not announced by brand names. It was broadcast through the flawless drape of his wool suit, the impeccable shine of his handcrafted leather Oxfords, and the cold, terrifying intelligence radiating from his piercing dark eyes. He moved with the predatory, unhurried grace of a silverback wolf who knew every other predator in the forest answered directly to him. Beside him walked my mother, Vivienne. If my father was the heavy, crushing hammer of the Sterling Empire, my mother was the sharp, surgical scalpel. She wore a simple, structured navy blue midi dress that likely cost more than the down payment on Beatrice's suburban house. Around her neck rested a single flawless strand of heirloom pearls that had been in our family for 4 generations. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon, exposing the sharp, aristocratic angles of her cheekbones. She carried no handbag, needing nothing to weigh her down. Her posture was rigidly straight, her chin tilted slightly upward, radiating an aura of absolute, undisputed superiority. They were the very physical embodiment of old money, a generation of generational wealth that did not need to scream for attention because it already owned the entire building. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and palpable. While Beatrice's hired influencer and Tasha's least friends looked merely confused by the intense security presence, the actual legitimate business owners and political figures scattered throughout the guest list immediately recognized the Titans who had just walked into the room, urgent. Panicked whispers began to spread quickly and uncontrollably through the wealthy crowd, catching like a dangerous, fast-moving wildfire racing through dry brush. "That is Richard Sterling." "What is he doing here?" I heard a prominent local judge mutter to his terrified wife. The woman beside him clamped a trembling hand over her mouth, staring at my mother in pure shock. "Vivian Sterling never attends public social events like this. Something is incredibly terribly wrong." The whispers multiplied, transforming the previously arrogant ballroom into a hive of nervous, vibrating anxiety. Men who had been proudly boasting about their modest stock portfolios mere minutes ago suddenly shrank back, attempting to make themselves appear as physically small and inconspicuous as possible. Women who had been flaunting their expensive designer gowns subtly crossed their arms, suddenly feeling deeply inadequate and profoundly underdressed in the presence of true, unbitten royalty. The Sterlings were not just rich. They were the invisible architects of Atlanta's entire economic infrastructure. They funded the mayoral campaigns, they owned the commercial real estate blocks downtown, and they sat on the anonymous boards of the hospitals and universities these guests desperately fought to get their children into. To see them materialize in the flesh, unannounced, and flanked by an aggressive security detail, was the social equivalent of watching a massive, devastating hurricane suddenly touch down on a perfectly sunny day. The guests instinctively knew that destruction was imminent, and they were all absolutely terrified of getting caught in the inevitable career-ending collateral damage. At the front of the room, standing frozen next to her gigantic, ridiculous fondant cake, Beatrice slowly lowered her bedazzled cake knife. Her ears caught the frantic, terrified whispers rippling through her audience. She heard the legendary name Sterling being passed from guest to guest. I watched from the dark shadows of the kitchen doors as the initial shock on my mother-in-law's heavily contoured face slowly morphed into an expression of profound, utterly delusional ecstasy. Beatrice's narcissistic status-obsessed brain immediately began performing the most astonishing mental gymnastics imaginable. She looked at Darius, who was still standing completely frozen by the disabled microphone. In her twisted, arrogant mind, the arrival of the city's most powerful, elusive billionaire couple could only mean one highly specific thing. She firmly believed they were the anonymous venture capital investors Darius had been loudly bragging about. She assumed Richard and Vivian Sterling had heard about her magnificent $50,000 birthday gala and decided to grace her with their elite presence to formally celebrate their newest, most brilliant, and highly valued business partner. Beatrice practically shoved her own daughter out of the way. Tasha stumbled in her tight sequined dress, barely catching herself before she crashed into the dessert table. Beatrice aggressively smoothed down the gaudy, sparkling fabric of her gold gown, pinching her cheeks to bring out a false, vibrant color. She plastered the most sickeningly sweet, sycophantic smile across her face, radiating a desperate, pathetic hunger for social validation. This was it. This was the exact moment she had taken out a second mortgage for. She was about to be photographed shaking hands with the undisputed king and queen of the Southern elite. "Excuse me, move aside, make way," Beatrice hissed at her own guests, aggressively pushing past the very same wealthy socialites she had spent the entire evening trying to impress. She marched straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She was completely blind to the cold, lethal fury radiating from my parents. She was entirely oblivious to the terrifying, unyielding physical stance of the 12 security guards surrounding the perimeter. Beatrice was a moth flying directly into a blazing, incinerating flame, completely convinced she was about to be crowned the new Queen of Atlanta. As Beatrice closed the distance, she threw her arms open wide, projecting a booming, overly familiar voice that echoed painfully through the tense, silent room. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, what an absolute honor. I am Beatrice Vance. Welcome to my exclusive 60th birthday celebration. We are so incredibly thrilled that you decided to join our intimate family gathering to support my brilliant and highly successful son-in-law Darius." She extended her manicured hand, expecting Richard to stop, take her hand, and offer his glowing congratulations. She expected Vivian to smile and compliment her ridiculous, garish gold dress. They did not even pause or break their confident, relentless stride. My parents continued walking forward with a heavy, rhythmic, terrifying momentum. As Beatrice stood directly in their path, hand outstretched and smiling like a desperate fool, Vivian Sterling did not even blink. My mother did not turn her head. She did not alter her facial expression. She looked right through Beatrice as if she were nothing more than a transparent, mildly inconvenient smudge of dirt on a glass window. Vivian simply kept walking, forcing Beatrice to jump frantically out of the way to avoid being physically trampled by my parents and their advancing security detail. Beatrice stumbled backward, her outstretched hand dropping awkwardly to her side. Her fake sycophantic smile completely froze, cracking under the immense weight of the most profound, humiliating public rejection she had ever truly experienced. The hired social media influencer who had been closely following Beatrice with her camera gimbal captured the entire devastating, humiliating sequence in glorious high definition. My parents ghosted right past the birthday girl without uttering a single solitary syllable. The sea of elite guests instinctively parted for them, like the Red Sea scrambling frantically out of their path, pressing their bodies tightly against the walls and dining tables to avoid making accidental eye contact. Richard and Vivian marched straight past the extravagant floral centerpieces. They walked directly past the premium open bar, where a pale sweating Darius was clutching his glass of bourbon like a lifeline. They moved flawlessly past a thoroughly confused and terrified Andre, who was desperately trying to comprehend why the most powerful billionaires in the state were storming through his mother's party. They did not stop for any of them. They ignored the desperate whispers and the gawking socialites completely. They kept their cold, furious eyes locked firmly on the back of the room, heading straight toward the dark, isolated corner by the swinging kitchen doors, where a supposedly poor, modest woman sat quietly in the shadows, tightly holding their precious, emotionally exhausted sleeping granddaughter in her fiercely protective arms. The heavy, rhythmic sound of my father's leather Oxfords striking the marble floor echoed with the finality of a ticking clock. Every single pair of eyes in the venue tracked their movement, completely captivated and entirely bewildered. The elite guests parted, pressing themselves into the tables, knocking over crystal water goblets in their sheer desperation to clear a path. Richard and Vivian Sterling were not walking toward the extravagant dessert table. They were not walking toward the premium open bar. They were marching deliberately into the cold, drafty shadows near the swinging kitchen doors and the public restrooms. As my parents closed the distance, the ambient temperature in our isolated corner seemed to shift. The harsh, unforgiving glare of the emergency lights caught the flawless pearls resting against my mother's collarbone. The catering staff, who had previously been ordered to starve my child and treat us like absolute garbage, practically flattened themselves against the stainless steel kitchen doors in sheer terror. The young waitress who had apologetically denied us bread covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with shock as she realized the true identity of the woman sitting quietly at her break table. I did not stand up to greet them. I simply sat in my rigid metal chair holding my sleeping daughter against my chest. Zuri stirred slightly in my arms, a soft whimper escaping her lips as the cold draft from the hallway washed over her again. My father reached our table first. This towering, terrifying titan of the Southern Financial District, a man who regularly brought rival CEOs to their knees with a single phone call, immediately dropped to one knee on the dirty, unpolished floor. He completely ignored the spilled water and the discarded napkins around us. His sharp, predatory eyes instantly softened into pools of profound, overwhelming paternal love the second he looked at Zuri. Without a single moment of hesitation, Richard Sterling slipped his arms out of his custom-tailored heavy cashmere overcoat. He gently wrapped the thick, expensive fabric entirely around Zuri's trembling shoulders, cocooning her in absolute warmth and impenetrable safety. "I have got you, little bird," my father whispered, his voice incredibly tender, a tone he reserved exclusively for his only grandchild. "Nobody is ever going to make you feel cold again." Zuri sighed happily, leaning her small head against my father's strong shoulder, instinctively recognizing the absolute security he provided. I looked up and met my mother's gaze. Vivian stood right beside my chair, her posture rigid, her jaw clenched tight. I saw the dangerous, lethal glint in her dark eyes. She looked at the cheap metal chair I was forced to sit in. She looked at the swinging kitchen doors. She looked at the absolute disrespect her daughter and granddaughter had been subjected to, and the silent fury radiating from her soul was palpable. "Are you hurt, Maya?" my mother asked softly, placing a warm, steady hand on my bare shoulder. "Only my patience," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I am completely finished playing their games." My mother offered a single sharp nod of approval. "Good. It is far past time we reminded these pathetic social climbers exactly who owns the ground they are walking on." Vivian Sterling slowly turned away from our isolated table. She deliberately squared her shoulders and faced the massive, silent ballroom. The 12 private security guards immediately stepped forward, closing ranks behind her, creating an impenetrable wall of black suits around our family. The absolute, unadulterated terror radiating from the crowd of guests was thick enough to choke on. The entire room stood perfectly paralyzed, holding their collective breath, desperately waiting to see where the wrath of the Sterling Empire would strike first. My mother's gaze swept over the frozen crowd with the calculated precision of a sniper. She bypassed the terrified local politicians. She ignored the sweating business owners. She locked her piercing, furious eyes directly onto the front of the room, staring dead into the horrified faces of Andre, Tasha, and Beatrice. The physical distance between the back of the room and the main family table did not diminish the lethal impact of my mother's stare. It only amplified the tension. Beatrice was still clutching the handle of her bedazzled cake knife, her mouth hanging wide open in an undignified, comical expression of pure shock. Tasha had unconsciously raised a trembling hand to her throat, her fingers desperately gripping her rented cubic zirconia necklace as if it could somehow protect her. Andre looked completely nauseous, his face drained of all color, his eyes darting frantically between his wealthy, influential in-laws and the dark corner where his wife and child sat wrapped in billionaire cashmere. The gears in Andre's status-obsessed brain were finally turning grinding together as he desperately tried to process the impossible reality unfolding right in front of his eyes. The modest, unambitious woman he had aggressively scolded and banished to the kitchen doors just 20 minutes ago was the sole heir to the Sterling family trust. The quiet, unbranded wife he had publicly humiliated to appease his arrogant, debt-ridden brother-in-law was actually the daughter of the most powerful, ruthless corporate monarchs in the entire state. The suffocating silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Nobody dared to move. Nobody dared to whisper. Even the hired influencer had lowered her camera, too terrified to record the impending execution. Then my mother spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not yell or scream like Beatrice had done earlier. Vivian Sterling's voice was a low, chilling, terrifyingly calm vibration that carried flawlessly across the dead, silent ballroom, echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings with devastating clarity. "Who in this room?" my mother asked, her tone dripping with a lethal, freezing venom. "Just called Richard Sterling's granddaughter trash." The sheer impact of that single, perfectly articulated sentence hit the ballroom like a physical shockwave. The guests physically recoiled, several people gasping audibly, as the devastating realization slammed into their minds. The beautiful, quiet little girl wearing the linen dress, the same child who had been viciously mocked and bullied in front of everyone, was the direct descendant of the Sterling dynasty. A collective, horrifying realization washed over the entire crowd. They had all stood by and watched the heir to a multi-billion-dollar empire get verbally abused and thrown into the shadows by a desperate, fake, bougie family clutching leased handbags. At the front table, Tasha let out a pathetic, strangled whimper. Her knees visibly buckled, causing her to heavily lean against the dessert table to keep from collapsing onto the marble floor. The arrogant, malicious smirk she had worn all evening was completely eradicated, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some kind of pathetic excuse or backpedal her vicious insults, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She simply stared at my mother with wide, horrified eyes, looking exactly like a cornered prey animal, realizing the trap had just snapped completely shut. Beatrice dropped the cake knife. The heavy silver utensil clattered loudly against the floor, a sharp, ringing noise that made everyone flinch. The matriarch of the Vance family, the woman who had proudly declared that chickens cannot stand with peacocks, suddenly realized she was entirely surrounded by apex predators. Her chest heaved with rapid, panicked breaths. She looked at me, sitting completely unfazed behind the wall of security guards, and the crushing weight of her massive, insurmountable mistake finally broke through her profound delusion. She had intentionally starved and humiliated the granddaughter of the people she had taken out a second mortgage just to impress. Andre looked like he was going to vomit right there on the dance floor. He took a shaky, unstable step forward, his hands raised in a desperate, pleading gesture. He looked at my father, who was still kneeling protectively beside Zuri, stroking her back with a fierce, uncompromising love Andre had never once shown his own daughter. "Mr. Sterling." Andre stammered, his voice cracking pathetically. "Sir, there has been a massive misunderstanding. Maya never told me. We had absolutely no idea who you were. I can explain everything. I swear I was just trying to keep the peace." My father slowly turned his head. He looked up at his son-in-law with an expression of such profound glacial disgust that Andre actually physically flinched backward. Richard Sterling did not raise his voice. He simply delivered a truth so heavy it crushed the remaining air out of my husband's lungs. "You are a weak, pathetic excuse for a man," my father said, his voice echoing cleanly across the frozen room. "A real man protects his family. You abandoned yours to chase the approval of clowns. You do not get to speak to me, and you will certainly never speak to my daughter again." Andre's mouth snapped shut. He looked around the room desperately, seeking a single ally, a friendly face, or even a sympathetic glance. He found absolutely nothing. The wealthy investors he had spent the entire evening pathetically groveling to were now looking at him like he carried a highly contagious, fatal disease. The men who had been laughing and drinking with Darius just moments ago were actively stepping away, creating a wide, highly visible physical barrier between themselves and the doomed Vance family. Nobody wanted to be standing anywhere near ground zero when the Sterling family dropped the final devastating bomb. Darius, realizing his entire fake empire was inherently tied to the family, currently being targeted for destruction, tried to quietly inch his way toward the side exit. He set his expensive glass of bourbon down on a passing tray and kept his head low, hoping the security guards would not notice his stealthy retreat. "Not so fast, Darius," my mother commanded, her sharp voice freezing him instantly in his tracks. "You like to brag about running with the wolves, do you not? Why do you not step into the light and see what happens when the real wolves finally arrive?" The entire ballroom held its breath. The Vance family stood completely exposed, stripped of their fake prestige and rented glamour, utterly paralyzed by the horrifying reality of their situation. I sat comfortably in my chair, holding my warm, sleeping daughter, entirely ready to watch my parents meticulously burn their pathetic, toxic world straight to the ground. The consequences of their arrogant cruelty had finally caught up to them, and absolute financial and social ruin was entirely unavoidable tonight. My father rose slowly from the cold floor, his movements deliberate and entirely unbothered by the hundreds of terrified eyes glued to his every motion. He brushed a non-existent speck of dust from his tailored trousers, ensuring Zuri remained securely wrapped in his cashmere coat, resting safely against my chest. He turned his attention fully toward the bar where Darius stood frozen, a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. With a single sharp snap of my father's fingers, the wall of security guards shifted. The formation parted just enough to allow a tall, severely dressed man with silver hair to step forward. This was Harrison, the Sterling family's chief legal counsel. Harrison carried a thick black leather portfolio, his face an impenetrable mask of corporate hostility. He moved to my father's side with the precise, intimidating efficiency of an executioner stepping up to the block. Darius swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly above his tight collar. The fake bravado he had displayed during his boastful speech was completely gone, replaced by the frantic shifting eyes of a cornered fraud. He took a hesitant step away from the bar, raising his hands in a weak defensive posture. "Mr. Sterling," Darius managed to choke out, his voice cracking under the crushing pressure of my father's gaze. "I assure you there is no need for this level of hostility. My firm is fully compliant. We are a legitimate, thriving enterprise. I have the utmost respect for your family and your business legacy. We are practically in the same industry." My father did not smile. He did not blink. He merely extended his right hand. Harrison immediately opened the black leather portfolio and placed a heavy stack of meticulously tabbed legal documents directly into my father's palm. The same industry, my father repeated the words rolling off his tongue with a dangerous, quiet amusement. That is an incredibly bold claim for a man who is currently drowning in 7 figures of high-interest debt and surviving entirely on a fabricated spreadsheet. A loud collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The wealthy investors and influential politicians who had been hanging on to Darius's every word just moments ago now stared at him with profound, unfiltered disgust. In the world of high finance, there was no sin greater than being a broke, posturing fraud. Darius turned a sickly shade of gray. His eyes darted toward Tasha, who was still leaning heavily against the dessert table, her face a mask of total bewilderment. Tasha had spent the entire evening flaunting her leased jewelry and bragging about her husband's immense success. The sheer, terrifying realization that her entire elite lifestyle was about to be publicly dismantled was slowly sinking into her status-obsessed brain. "That is not true!" Darius shouted, his voice pitching up in a desperate, panicked whine. He pointed an accusing finger at my father, abandoning all pretense of respect. "You have no idea what you are talking about. My firm is highly liquid. I just secured $2 million in seed funding this morning from an exclusive venture capital group. I have the wire transfer confirmations to prove it. My business is absolutely rock solid." My father let out a low, chilling chuckle that sent a visible shiver down Darius's spine. He held up the stack of legal documents, his dark eyes locking onto his terrified target. "Yes, the famous $2 million seed funding," my father said smoothly. "You were bragging quite loudly about that anonymous venture capital firm earlier. You claimed they reviewed your brilliant market projections and practically begged to give you their capital. You called yourself a self-made alpha running with the wolves." Darius stood rigidly, his chest heaving as he tried to maintain his crumbling facade. He nodded sharply, attempting to project a false sense of unshakable confidence. "That is exactly right. They saw my undeniable potential. They understand my vision for the Southern Financial District." My father handed the top document from the stack to Harrison. "Read the name of the holding company listed as the primary financial benefactor on Mr. Vance's newly acquired investment portfolio." Harrison adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the official legally binding contract. He spoke loudly, ensuring his crisp, authoritative voice reached every single corner of the expansive ballroom. "The primary benefactor and sole owner of the $2 million venture capital fund wired to Mr. Vance this morning is Sterling Vanguard Holdings. This firm is a direct subsidiary trust fully owned and operated by Richard and Vivian Sterling." The absolute deafening silence that followed that revelation was the most beautiful, satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I watched the devastating truth crash over the Vance family like a tidal wave of pure, unfiltered humiliation. Darius staggered backward, his rented dress shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble. He grabbed the edge of the wooden bar to keep from collapsing. His mouth opened and closed silently, his brain entirely unable to process the catastrophic reality of the situation. The anonymous, highly exclusive venture capital firm he had been worshipping, the mysterious financial backers he believed had finally recognized his unparalleled genius, was actually just my father. Tasha let out a sharp, hysterical shriek. She rushed forward, grabbing Darius by the arm, her fake fingernails digging desperately into his tailored jacket. "Tell them they are lying, Darius!" She screamed, her voice cracking with sheer panic. "Tell them you earned that money yourself. You said you were a self-made millionaire. You promised me we were finally going to be rich." Darius could not look at his wife. He could not look at the investors. He could only stare at the floor, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming, suffocating shame of his public exposure. My father stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the pathetic, trembling man who had dared to insult my daughter. He did not raise his voice, but the lethal intensity behind his words commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. "You are not a self-made alpha, Darius," my father stated coldly. "You are a desperate, incompetent beggar. Your investment firm has been bleeding money for 3 consecutive years. Every legitimate, respectable bank in this state has categorically rejected your desperate loan applications because your credit score is an absolute joke. You have absolutely zero liquid assets, zero legitimate clients, and zero business acumen. The crowd of elite guests murmured in horror, physically stepping further away from the disgraced couple. The social contagion of poverty and fraud was something these high society climbers avoided at all absolute costs. But I am a successful consultant, Darius pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic, whiny sob. I have the cars, I have the luxury apartment, I have the lifestyle. My father scoffed, a sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. You have a mountain of leased rented garbage. Harrison, please enlighten the room regarding the actual state of Mr. Vance's personal finances. Harrison flipped to the second page of the legal portfolio. He read the financial details with the detached mechanical precision of an auditor. The Lamborghini, currently parked in the VIP section of the country club lot, is leased under a high-interest subprime auto loan that is currently 90 days past due. The luxury penthouse apartment the Vance family occupies is heavily mortgaged, and they are facing an active eviction notice filed 48 hours ago. The jewelry Mrs. Vance is currently wearing was rented from a high-end boutique in Buckhead, and the credit card used to secure the deposit was declined this afternoon. Tasha covered her face with her hands, letting out a loud, agonizing wail of profound embarrassment. The glittering, wealthy illusion she had spent years meticulously crafting and weaponizing against me was completely, violently ripped away. She was not a wealthy socialite. She was a broke, desperate woman, dripping in rented, unpaid luxury, standing exposed in front of the very people she had tried so hard to impress. Beatrice, who had been standing frozen near the front table, finally found her voice. She rushed forward, her gaudy gold dress swishing loudly as she desperately tried to salvage the burning wreckage of her family's reputation. "Mr. Sterling, please," Beatrice begged, her voice trembling with intense panic. "There must be some sort of mistake. My son-in-law is a brilliant, respected financial mind. He manages millions. He is a legitimate visionary." My mother, Vivian, stepped out from behind the wall of security guards. She moved with the lethal, silent grace of a striking viper. She stopped directly in front of Beatrice, her dark eyes flashing with a cold, terrifying rage. "The only visionary thing your pathetic son-in-law has ever done is submit fraudulent accounting documents to secure capital he never earned," my mother said, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. "And the only reason my husband's trust approved that $2 million transfer was because my daughter, the woman you just banished to sit by the public restrooms, personally requested we throw your drowning, incompetent family a financial lifeline." Beatrice gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked at me sitting quietly in the shadows with Zuri, and the horrifying, devastating truth finally connected in her status-obsessed brain. The quiet, unbranded woman she had relentlessly bullied and degraded for 6 years was the sole reason her golden son-in-law had not been thrown into federal prison for bankruptcy long ago. My father turned his attention back to Darius, who was visibly shaking, sweat pouring down his face, completely ruined. "You stood in this room and bragged about your superiority," my father said, his tone devoid of any mercy. "You mocked my family. You wore clothes paid for by my hidden charity, and you used that unearned arrogance to humiliate my blood. I gave you the rope, Darius, and you enthusiastically tied your own noose." Darius let out a shaky, pathetic breath, his knees finally buckling under the massive, unbearable weight of his total public destruction. He slumped against the heavy wooden bar, sliding down until he was practically sitting on the floor. He buried his sweating face in his hands, completely broken. The grand $50,000 birthday celebration had completely transformed into an absolute, magnificent slaughter. The entire ballroom watched in captivated horror as the Vance family illusion shattered permanently. Darius realized he had lost absolutely everything he had ever pretended to own, and the absolute worst part was knowing he had done it to himself. And my father was absolutely not finished with them yet. Richard stepped closer to the crumpled figure of Darius. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Tasha's ragged, panicked breathing. Richard extended his hand without looking back. Harrison, anticipating the exact move, placed a crisp official document into my father's open palm. You have absolutely no right to interfere with my investments, Darius weakly attempted to argue, though his voice shook uncontrollably. Darius Vance. My father began, his voice ringing with the finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. Under the stipulations of the capital investment agreement you signed mere days ago, Sterling Vanguard Holdings reserves the right to immediately freeze recall and completely terminate any and all financial backing in the event of gross ethical violations, material misrepresentation of assets, or suspected fraudulent activity. My father tossed the document. It fluttered down, landing directly on Darius's expensive rented leather shoes. I am officially revoking the $2 million seed funding, my father announced. The wire transfer has been intercepted and reversed by our banking partners. You currently possess absolutely zero capital from my family. Your accounts are entirely frozen. Darius let out a pathetic guttural sound. He scrambled to his knees, his hands grasping desperately at the empty air. Please, Mr. Sterling, you cannot do this. If you pull that funding, my creditors will destroy me. I will lose the firm. I will lose everything. Give me a chance to restructure. I can generate a massive return on your investment. My father did not flinch. He looked down at the groveling man with eyes devoid of a single ounce of mercy. You do not have a firm to restructure, Darius, my father stated flatly. What you have is a hastily constructed, deeply illegal Ponzi scheme. My forensic accountant spent the entire afternoon tearing through your fake ledgers. You have been actively using new investor capital to pay off the exorbitant high-interest loans you took out to fund your pathetic, flashy lifestyle. Darius went completely rigid. The color entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost under the harsh emergency lights. Did you honestly believe a financial institution like mine would hand you $2 million without conducting a ruthless, microscopic audit of your entire miserable existence? My father asked, his tone dripping with lethal condescension. My legal team compiled every single instance of your wire fraud, your falsified tax returns, and your fraudulent investor reports. We did not just recall our funding. We packaged your entire criminal history into a neat, comprehensive file and handed it directly to the white-collar crime division of the FBI. A sharp, horrified shriek ripped through the ballroom. Tasha stumbled forward, her hands clawing at her own hair. The FBI. Tasha screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical, high-pitched wail. Darius, tell me he is lying. Tell me we are not going to federal prison. We are supposed to be rich. You promised me we were joining the elite. Darius could not answer her. He remained on his knees, staring blankly at the marble floor, completely paralyzed by the sheer devastating magnitude of his impending incarceration. Tasha looked around at the judging, disgusted faces of the wealthy socialites she had spent the entire evening trying to impress. The reality of her situation hit her with the force of a speeding train. The luxury penthouse apartment she had been bragging about was heavily mortgaged and facing eviction. The sleek Lamborghini parked out front was 90 days past due and about to be repossessed. Every single designer item she was wearing was completely unpaid for. My clothes. Tasha hyperventilated, her hands frantically ripping at the rented cubic zirconia necklace around her throat. She scratched her own skin in her desperate haste to remove the fake jewelry. They are going to take my clothes. They are going to take the car. I cannot be poor. I will not go back to being poor. She collapsed onto the floor next to her ruined husband, sobbing hysterically. Her heavy, expensive makeup ran down her face in dark, ugly streaks. The glamorous, untouchable image she had weaponized against me just an hour ago was entirely destroyed. She was nothing more than a desperate, broke woman crying over rented jewelry in front of the entire Atlanta elite. My father turned his back on them, dismissing their existence completely. Andre stood frozen a few feet away, watching his sister and brother-in-law disintegrate into a puddle of absolute financial ruin. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. The profound, sickening realization of his own catastrophic mistake was visibly settling over his features. He had proudly sided with a criminal fraud over his own loyal wife. He had aggressively defended a sinking ship while actively burning the only bridge that could have possibly saved him. Andre's desperate status-obsessed eyes darted away from the pathetic display on the floor and locked directly onto me. I sat completely still in my rigid metal chair at the back of the room, my expression calm and utterly impenetrable, keeping Zuri safely tucked against my chest beneath my father's cashmere coat. Survival instinct, raw and incredibly cowardly, immediately kicked in. Andre realized with sudden absolute clarity that the quiet, unassuming woman he had just banished to the kitchen doors was actually the most powerful, influential entity in the entire room. She was his only remaining lifeline. If he could just reach me, if he could just manufacture a convincing apology and play the role of the manipulated, apologetic husband, he might be able to salvage his fragile, crumbling world. Maya Andre gasped, his voice tight with rising panic. He lunged forward, his rented tuxedo shoes slipping slightly as he pushed past the stunned, silent guests. He raised his hands in a frantic, placating gesture, his face twisting into a mask of pathetic, manufactured desperation. "Maya, baby, please listen to me," Andre pleaded, his voice cracking as he hurried toward the staff table. "I did not know. I swear to God, I had absolutely no idea he was a fraud. My mother pressured me. You know how she gets. You know how manipulative she can be. I was just trying to keep the peace. I love you. I love Zuri. Please, you have to tell your father this is all a massive misunderstanding." He closed the distance rapidly, extending his arms as if he intended to grab my hands and pull me into a false, comforting embrace. I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle. I knew I did not have to. Before Andre could get anywhere near our isolated corner, a massive, impenetrable wall of bespoke tailoring and pure, concentrated menace stepped directly into his path. Richard Sterling physically blocked the narrow aisle between the catering doors and the main ballroom floor. My father did not shove him. He simply stood there, a towering, immovable mountain of absolute authority, radiating a terrifying energy that forced Andre to slam on the brakes and stagger backward. "You will not take another step toward my daughter," my father commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that demanded instant, absolute compliance. "You will not speak her name. You will not look at my granddaughter. If you attempt to close the physical distance between us, my security team will gladly demonstrate exactly what happens to men who threaten the Sterling family." Andre held his hands up defensively, his eyes wide with genuine primal fear. He looked at the 12 massive security guards who had immediately shifted their aggressive stances, clearly ready to execute my father's orders without a fraction of hesitation. "Mr. Sterling, please. You have to let me speak to my wife," Andre begged, his voice dropping into a pathetic, whiny register. "I am a good man. I am a successful provider. I am a senior director at a highly respected financial firm. I provide for Maya and Zuri. I have built a solid, respectable career. You cannot just destroy my family over a stupid argument at a birthday party." My father stared at Andre with an expression of such profound glacial pity that it was almost difficult to witness. It was the look a man gives a deeply confused, incredibly insignificant insect right before he steps on it. "You provide for her?" My father asked, the sheer incredulity in his tone echoing across the silent room. "You honestly believe your pathetic, mid-level corporate salary provides for the sole heir to the Sterling Empire?" My father raised his left hand, snapping his fingers once again. Harrison, moving with the same robotic, terrifying efficiency as before, stepped forward. He bypassed my father and walked straight up to the small, circular cocktail table situated right next to Andre. Harrison raised the heavy black leather portfolio and forcefully slammed a thick, sealed dossier directly onto the tabletop. The sharp, explosive smack of the heavy files hitting the wood made Andre jump violently. "You have absolutely no idea who you married, do you?" my father asked smoothly, his dark eyes locking onto his terrified son-in-law. "You have spent 6 years strutting around bragging about your minor promotions and your mediocre client list, completely blind to the fact that you have never actually earned a single achievement on your own merit." Andre stared at the thick dossier resting on the cocktail table, a cold, sickening sense of dread washing over his sweaty features. The desperate, arrogant illusion of his self-made corporate success was about to be meticulously, ruthlessly dismantled. I stood up from the rigid metal chair by the kitchen doors. I gently transferred my sleeping daughter into my father's waiting, protective arms. He held Zuri with a reverence that Andre had never once shown his own child. I stepped out of the shadows and walked slowly toward the cocktail table where the heavy dossier rested. Andre's eyes remained locked on the thick manila folder, as if it were a live explosive device waiting to detonate. "Open it," I commanded, my voice echoing in the dead silent ballroom. Andre's hands shook violently as he reached out and flipped open the heavy cover. The first page was a comprehensive summary of his entire client roster. "You always bragged to anyone who would listen about landing the most prestigious accounts in the city," I said, making sure my voice carried clearly to the back of the room so every single socialite could hear his profound shame. "The Caldwell Portfolio, the Vanguard Real Estate Trust, the Regional Hospital Endowment. You truly thought you had outsmarted the senior partners at your firm. You genuinely believed your brilliant pitch meetings secured those multi-million-dollar contracts." Andre stared at the printed pages, his eyes wide and panicked, as he read the irrefutable proof staring back at him. He saw the transfer routing numbers, the hidden proxy signatures, and the internal memos from Sterling Wealth Management executives directing those exact funds straight to his specific desk. "I engineered your entire career from the ground up," I revealed, the truth crashing down on him with a devastating, undeniable force. "Every single promotion you received over the last 5 years was secretly mandated by my family's financial network. We funneled those massive accounts directly to your firm with one strict, non-negotiable condition attached. You had to be the lead account manager." Andre looked up, his face completely pale and slick with terrified sweat. Why, he choked out his voice, barely a pathetic broken whisper. "Why would you do that without ever telling me?" "Because I loved you," I stated coldly, feeling absolutely nothing for the ruined man standing before me. "I wanted Zuri to have a strong, confident father. I knew exactly how desperately you craved corporate validation. I knew you felt deeply inadequate because you came from a family obsessed with superficial status and fake luxury. I pulled powerful strings in the shadows to build your fragile self-esteem. I wanted you to feel like the ultimate provider, so you could focus entirely on being a good husband and a fiercely protective father to our daughter." I took a slow, deliberate step closer, my eyes locking onto his terrified face, pinning him in place. "But you took the confidence I secretly bought for you and used it to completely abandon us. You used the wealth my family quietly provided to look down on me. When your arrogant sister viciously bullied our 6-year-old daughter tonight, you did not protect her. You chose to protect your fake, fragile image in front of a man who is currently headed to federal prison. You chose to aggressively kiss up to a total fraud, while your own child cried in the dark by the public restrooms." Andre shook his head frantically, heavy tears finally spilling down his cheeks and ruining his stiff collar. "Maya, please, you know how hard I worked for us. You know the exhausting hours I put in at the office every single week." "You put in hours managing my money," I corrected ruthlessly, stripping away his last remaining shred of dignity. "And because you showed me exactly what kind of father you truly are tonight, that protective support is entirely gone." While you were laughing at the bar and toasting to Darius, I logged into the Sterling executive server. I sent a direct, high-priority email to the senior partners at your firm. I completely withdrew every single Sterling-affiliated portfolio. The only condition I gave them to halt the total financial collapse of their entire firm was your immediate, unconditional termination. Right on cue, a sharp, vibrating buzz erupted from Andre's rented tuxedo jacket pocket. The sudden invasive noise made him flinch violently, as if he had been physically struck. He slowly reached inside and pulled out his smartphone. His hands trembled so severely, he almost dropped the expensive device onto the marble floor. The bright screen lit up with an urgent notification from the managing partner of his firm. Andre opened the message with a shaking thumb. I watched his panicked eyes frantically scan the brief, unforgiving text. The remaining color drained from his face completely. The phone slipped from his numb fingers, hitting the floor with a loud, sharp crack that shattered the glass screen. He had been terminated effective, immediately stripped of his title, his impressive salary, and his entire fabricated professional identity. He was absolutely nothing. A loud, agonizing wail shattered the heavy silence of the ballroom. Beatrice, unable to witness the total destruction of her golden sun, threw herself forward. She stumbled past the massive, neglected fondant cake, her gaudy gold sequined dress swishing loudly as she dropped to her knees beside Andre. She grabbed his arm, sobbing hysterically, her carefully applied makeup running in dark, ugly rivers down her flushed cheeks. "Please, you cannot do this to my boy," Beatrice begged, looking up at me with wild, desperate eyes. "He is a good man. He just made a silly mistake tonight. You are destroying his entire life over a tiny, insignificant seating arrangement. I am begging you, Maya. Have some mercy. We are family." Before I could even formulate a response to her pathetic, manipulative plea, Vivian Sterling moved. My mother stepped forward, her posture rigidly straight, exuding the terrifying, untouchable elegance of true old money. She looked down at Beatrice groveling on the floor with an expression of pure, unadulterated disdain. "You do not get to speak the word family in our presence," my mother stated, her voice a low, chilling vibration that commanded the absolute attention of every single guest in the venue. "You deliberately starved my granddaughter. You banished my blood to a folding table by the kitchen doors because you thought she did not fit your incredibly cheap, vulgar aesthetic. You proudly declared that chickens cannot stand with peacocks." Beatrice sobbed louder, clasping her hands together in a desperate praying motion. "I am sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. I did not know who you were. I swear I would have treated her like royalty if I had only known she was a Sterling. I will do anything to fix this. Please, Mrs. Sterling, I just paid a fortune to join this elite country club. This was supposed to be my grand society debut. Do not take this away from my family." My mother let out a sharp, humorless laugh that cut through the room like a jagged blade. "Your society debut," she repeated mockingly. "You took out a reckless second mortgage on your highly unremarkable suburban home to rent a ballroom that you believed would elevate your pathetic social standing. You practically begged for acceptance from people who secretly despise your loud, classless behavior." Vivienne took a slow, intimidating step closer to the sobbing matriarch. "Let me educate you on how true wealth operates in the city, Beatrice. The Sterling family does not just attend exclusive events at this country club. We own the primary real estate holding company that fully purchased this entire resort property over a decade ago. We own the pristine golf course you desperately want to walk on. We own the very marble floor you are currently crying on." Beatrice gasped, her eyes widening in pure, unadulterated horror as the catastrophic reality of her situation finally took hold. She looked around the lavish ballroom, suddenly realizing that every beautiful, expensive detail she had maxed out her credit cards to rent actually belonged to the woman glaring down at her. As the majority shareholder and the silent chairwoman of the membership committee, my mother continued with brutal, surgical precision. "I am officially revoking your country club membership for life. Your name has been permanently blacklisted from every single elite establishment in Atlanta. You will never step foot on this property again. The reason for your permanent expulsion will be publicly listed as severe code of conduct violations, specifically highlighting your grotesque discriminatory behavior toward a minor child." Beatrice let out a strangled, breathless cry, shaking her head in violent denial. "No, please, you cannot. I paid $50,000 for this party. I signed the contracts. I am a paying client. You have to honor the event. I am honoring the event by allowing you to fully experience the consequences of your exorbitant spending," my mother replied coldly. "Since you decided to act like an arrogant tyrant tonight, all complimentary services, promotional discounts, and grace periods previously attached to your account have been entirely revoked." My mother gestured slightly to her left. The general manager of the country club, still sweating and visibly terrified of my parents, hurried forward. He carried a silver tray holding a crisp, freshly printed invoice. He stopped next to Beatrice and nervously extended the tray down to her trembling hands. Beatrice looked at the piece of paper as if it were a venomous snake. She slowly reached out and took the invoice, her eyes scanning the bottom line. She let out a loud, agonizing scream that echoed painfully off the vaulted ceiling. The total bill, completely unadjusted and demanding immediate full payment, was $50,000. She had absolutely no way to pay it. Hey, no secret funds to fall back on, and her son could no longer bail her out. She was entirely irreversibly bankrupt. Andre fell to his knees beside his shattered phone, his hands hovering over the broken glass, as if he could magically piece his ruined career back together. The wealthy guests who had previously tolerated Beatrice's obnoxious social climbing now looked at her with pure, unadulterated pity. The glittering, opulent ballroom had fully transformed into a grand arena of absolute karmic justice. Every single lie they had told, every single rented luxury they had flaunted, and every single cruel insult they had hurled at my innocent daughter had returned to utterly demolish their lives. Beatrice clutched the crisp white invoice to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably into the expensive imported silk tablecloth that draped the front table, her fake bougie empire completely reduced to absolute ashes. "You wanted to act like a peacock, Beatrice," my mother said, delivering the final devastating blow as she looked down at the ruined woman. "Now you get to pay the peacock's price. I highly suggest you start figuring out how to liquidate your assets because my accounting department will pursue that debt until you have absolutely nothing left." I watched the two people who had made my life a miserable, stressful performance, crying on the polished marble floor. They had desperately wanted to be treated like high society royalty, and my family had graciously accommodated them by delivering a swift, utterly merciless royal execution. The silence in the ballroom did not last long. The absolute shock that had paralyzed the Vance family quickly mutated into something far more volatile. Stripped of their fake wealth, their rented luxury, and their carefully manufactured social standing, the underlying toxicity of their relationships was instantly laid bare. Without the comforting blanket of my family's hidden money to soften their miserable lives, they immediately turned on each other with the vicious, predictable savagery of starving animals fighting over a single scrap of meat. Tasha was the first to completely snap. She scrambled up from the marble floor, her sequined dress catching under her rented heels as she lunged toward her husband. She slammed her hands aggressively against Darius's chest, her face contorted in an ugly mask of pure betrayal and rage. "You lied to me!" Tasha screamed, her shrill voice echoing painfully off the vaulted ceilings. "You looked me in the eyes and promised me we were millionaires. You made me brag to all of my friends. You made me act like I was royalty. You are nothing but a broke, pathetic criminal. You ruined my life." Darius did not absorb the blows passively. His own fragile ego had been utterly decimated, and he lashed out to protect whatever tiny fraction of his pride remained. He grabbed Tasha by the wrists, shoving her backwards so forcefully she nearly collided with a passing security guard. "I lied to you," Darius bellowed, his face dark with furious indignation. "You are the one who demanded the luxury penthouse. You are the one who maxed out 5 different credit cards just to buy designer shoes you cannot even walk in. I had to commit wire fraud just to keep up with your endless, greedy, suffocating demands. You drained me dry, Tasha. You are nothing but a shallow, miserable parasite." Tasha shrieked in outrage, reaching up to unclasp the heavy, fake cubic zirconia necklace from her throat. She hurled the cheap jewelry directly at his face. It bounced off Darius's cheek and skittered uselessly across the polished floor, completely ignored by the wealthy guests who were watching the domestic implosion with undisguised, profound disgust. A few feet away, Beatrice was still clutching the $50,000 invoice to her chest, her breathing rapid and shallow. She looked frantically between her screaming daughter and her disgraced son-in-law, desperately searching for a way to transfer the crushing weight of her own catastrophic mistakes. Her wild, panicked eyes finally landed on Andre, her golden son, the man she had always manipulated to fix her careless, extravagant disasters. Beatrice scrambled across the floor on her hands and knees, entirely abandoning whatever shred of dignity she had left. She grabbed the fabric of Andre's trousers, violently shaking his leg. "Andre, you have to fix this," Beatrice wailed, waving the venue invoice in his face. "You have savings. You have a massive corporate salary. You need to pay this bill right now before they call the police. You have to save your mother. You have to fix this disaster." Andre stared down at his mother with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. The absolute loyalty he had shown her for his entire life evaporated in a single devastating instant. He violently yanked his leg out of her desperate grasp, stepping backward to put physical distance between himself and the woman who had just cost him his entire career. "Pay it with what, Mom?" Andre roared, his voice cracking wildly as he pointed a shaking finger at his shattered smartphone on the ground. Did you not just hear them? I am completely unemployed. My firm just fired me. My entire professional network has blacklisted me because of you. I do not have a massive corporate salary anymore. I lost absolutely everything tonight because I listened to your pathetic, delusional obsession with social status. You forced me to treat my own wife like garbage, and now I am completely ruined. Beatrice gasped, recoiling as if he had physically struck her across the face. She collapsed back onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, completely abandoned by the son she had ruthlessly controlled for over 3 decades. I stood in the shadows by the kitchen doors, watching this miserable, chaotic display of mutual destruction unfold. There was absolutely no loyalty among them. Their entire family dynamic was a hollow, fragile transaction built strictly on the illusion of financial gain. The very second the money evaporated, their supposed unconditional love vanished into thin air. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of relief wash over my entire soul. For 6 grueling years, I had constantly questioned my own sanity, wondering if I was the problem, wondering if I was simply too sensitive or too ungrateful to appreciate their particular brand of family bonding. Tonight provided the ultimate undeniable clarity. They were exactly the toxic, irredeemable monsters I had always known they were. My father stood a few steps in front of me, his broad shoulders serving as an impenetrable shield between my daughter and the screaming madness on the dance floor. Zuri remained safely asleep, her small chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm beneath the heavy warmth of my father's cashmere overcoat. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her mother was actively changing the entire trajectory of her future. I gently touched my father's arm. He turned his head slightly, his dark, protective eyes locking onto mine. I offered him a slow, reassuring nod. "I am ready," I whispered softly. My father stepped aside, creating a clear, unobstructed path for me to walk. My mother, Vivian, stood by the edge of the security perimeter, her posture rigid and victorious. She offered me a brief, proud smile as I stepped out from the cold, drafty hallway and moved onto the main ballroom floor. The chaotic screaming of the Vance family abruptly halted the second they noticed my movement. The entire venue fell into a thick, breathless silence. The elite guests, the politicians, and the wealthy socialites all turned their heads to watch my approach. I did not walk with arrogance. I did not strut or gloat. I moved with a terrifying, serene calmness that only comes from achieving absolute, total emotional detachment. I was no longer the subservient, accommodating daughter-in-law desperately seeking their approval. I was the undisputed architect of their total ruin, and I was walking through the ashes of their fake empire with supreme, effortless grace. Andre saw me walking toward him. His frantic, bloodshot eyes widened with a sudden, desperate surge of pathetic hope. His fractured mind desperately grasped at a wildly delusional fantasy. He thought I was walking over to forgive him. He genuinely believed that because I had endured his spineless behavior for 6 years, I would somehow magically excuse the ultimate betrayal he had committed tonight. Maya Andre gasped, his voice trembling as he took a tentative step toward me. He completely ignored his mother weeping on the floor and his sister screaming at her husband. He focused entirely on me, raising his hands in a frantic, pleading gesture. "Maya, thank God. Listen to me. You were right. You were absolutely right about everything. They are toxic. My mother is a monster. Tasha is insane. I see it now. I see exactly what they have been doing to us." I stopped walking when I reached a small glass-topped cocktail table situated just a few feet away from him. I looked at the man I had once vowed to spend the rest of my life with. There was no love left in my heart. There was no anger, no sadness, no resentment. There was only a vast, empty void where my marriage used to reside. "We can leave them behind," Andre babbled, his words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate rush. He took another step closer, but a security guard immediately shifted his stance, forcing Andre to freeze in place. "I will cut them off completely, Maya. I will never speak to my mother again. I will never answer Tasha's calls. It can just be you, me, and Zuri. We can go back to our beautiful life. You just have to tell your father to reinstate my job. You just have to reverse the emails you sent. We can fix this. Please, baby, I will do whatever you want. I will be the husband you need. I stared at him, observing the sheer unapologetic cowardice radiating from his pores. He was fully prepared to throw his own mother and his own sister directly under the bus to save his own skin. He had absolutely no moral compass, no backbone, and no loyalty to anyone but himself. If the situation were reversed, if Darius had actually possessed real wealth, and I was truly a poor, struggling charity worker, Andre would have gladly left me sitting by the restrooms forever. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or hurl insults. I simply reached into the deep hidden compartment of my tote bag. My fingers bypassed the cold, discarded metal of my wedding rings lying at the bottom of the purse. Instead, I grabbed a thick, crisp manila envelope. I had secretly asked Harrison to draft the contents of this envelope 3 months ago, keeping it hidden in my bag as a desperate worst-case contingency plan. Tonight, that contingency had become an absolute necessity. I pulled the thick stack of premium legal paper out of the envelope. The stark white pages contrasted sharply with the dim ambient lighting of the room. I placed the documents gently onto the glass surface of the cocktail table. I reached into my bag one more time and pulled out a sleek black fountain pen. Andre stared at the documents, his desperate, pleading smile faltering. His eyes scanned the bold, capitalized black text printed at the very top of the first page. The color completely drained from his already pale face. His jaw went slack, and a low, agonizing groan escaped his throat as he realized exactly what he was looking at. "Maya, no." Andre whispered, his voice cracking into a broken, pathetic sob. "Please, you cannot do this. We have a child together. We built a home. You cannot just throw 6 years of marriage away over a single mistake. Please, I am begging you. Do not sign that. I will do anything." I uncapped the fountain pen. The small metallic click sounded incredibly loud in the hushed, observant silence of the ballroom. I leaned over the glass cocktail table. I did not hesitate. I did not pause to reconsider. I pressed the sharp nib of the pen against the signature line and signed my full legal name with smooth, unbroken, decisive strokes. I signed the second page, then the third, legally finalizing the absolute termination of my marriage. I placed the pen down on the glass table. I picked up the signed divorce papers and held them out toward him. Andre's hands shook violently as he reached out and took the heavy stack of documents. He stared down at my signature, heavy tears dripping from his chin onto the crisp white paper smudging the fresh black ink. I looked him dead in the eyes, ensuring my final words would be permanently burned into his memory for the rest of his miserable life. "You chose to protect your family's ego. I am choosing to protect my daughter." I did not wait for Andre to respond. There was nothing left for him to say, and nothing left for me to hear. I turned my back on the pathetic man who had traded his entire future for a fleeting moment of fake societal approval. Every step I took away from that glass cocktail table felt like a heavy, suffocating chain snapping clean off my spirit. For 6 years, I had shrunk myself down to make him feel tall. I had swallowed my pride, hidden my immense resources, and endured his family's relentless toxic abuse, all under the naive delusion that my patience would eventually be rewarded with genuine loyalty. Tonight had proven that loyalty was a foreign concept to the Vance family. They only understood transactions, and their ultimate transaction had just bankrupted them in every conceivable way. I walked with my head held high, my posture mirroring the rigid, unyielding elegance of my mother. The wealthy guests, who had gathered to witness the spectacle, stepped back, carving a wide, unobstructed path across the polished marble floor. Nobody dared to meet my eyes. The people who had laughed at Tasha's cruel jokes, the influencers who had recorded my initial humiliation, the investors who had toasted to Darius's fraudulent success, they all stared at their expensive shoes, terrified that making eye contact might draw the wrath of the Sterling Empire onto their fragile lives. I felt an exhilarating rush of pure liberation. I was no longer the subservient wife. I was Maya Sterling, and I was finally going home. When I reached the back of the room, my father was already standing. He had transferred Zuri into his strong arms, keeping her head tucked securely against his broad shoulder. My beautiful daughter remained blissfully asleep, protected by the thick, luxurious warmth of her grandfather's custom cashmere overcoat. My mother Vivian stood flawlessly beside him, her sharp, aristocratic features radiating cold, magnificent satisfaction. She offered me a single approving nod. It was the silent, powerful acknowledgement between two women who knew exactly how to dismantle an enemy without ever raising their voices. "You handled that perfectly," my father murmured, his deep voice filled with undeniable pride. "Let us leave this garbage out on the curb where it belongs." He gestured slightly with his free hand. The 12 massive, black-suited security guards instantly shifted their tactical formation. They moved with military precision, creating an impenetrable human shield around our small family. 2 guards took the lead, marching directly toward the heavy mahogany exit doors. 4 guards flanked our sides, while the remaining 6 formed a solid, protective wall behind us, completely sealing us off from the burning wreckage of the ballroom. We began our final procession out of the venue. The rhythmic, synchronized sound of our footsteps echoed loudly, a steady, terrifying drumbeat, signaling the absolute end of the Vance family's reign of arrogant terror. Behind the protective wall of our security detail, the grand $50,000 birthday celebration was actively deteriorating into a spectacular, ugly riot of mutual destruction. I did not look back, but the sharp, echoing acoustics of the ballroom painted a vivid, horrifying picture of their total collapse. Beatrice was still wailing on the floor, her dramatic, agonizing sobs tearing through the air. She was desperately screaming at the venue manager, begging him for a payment plan, pleading for a discount, loudly offering to scrub the country club floors if they would just forgive the massive invoice. The manager, acting on my mother's strict, uncompromising directives, coldly informed her that the police would be called if the bill was not settled by morning. Tasha's shrill, hysterical voice pierced the chaos next. She was actively physically attacking Darius, her hands slapping wildly against his chest. She screamed about her ruined reputation, her repossessed luxury cars, and the sheer embarrassing indignity of having to return to a normal, working-class life. She demanded he fix the frozen accounts, completely unable to grasp the reality that the money was permanently gone. Darius was shouting back, his voice cracking with panicked, defensive rage. He blamed Tasha for his massive, insurmountable debt, screaming that her greedy, insatiable obsession with designer labels had forced him into committing federal wire fraud. He cursed her vanity, publicly exposing every single financial lie they had told to maintain their fake, glamorous lifestyle. And then there was Andre. My ex-husband was completely terrifyingly silent. He did not join the screaming match. He did not attempt to comfort his sobbing mother. He was simply standing frozen by the cocktail table, staring blankly at the signed divorce papers in his trembling hands. The crushing, inescapable realization of his own monumental stupidity had entirely paralyzed him. He had traded a billionaire heiress, a brilliant career, and a beautiful daughter for a single fleeting nod of approval from a convicted fraudster. He was completely, utterly alone, entirely stripped of his title, his wealth, and his family. The elite socialites, the very people Beatrice and Andre had sacrificed my dignity to impress, were actively abandoning them. The wealthy guests were frantically rushing toward the side exits, desperate to flee the toxic radioactive fallout of the Vance family's public execution. They left their half-empty champagne flutes on the tables. They abandoned their expensive, untouched dinners. Nobody wanted to be associated with a family facing federal indictments and catastrophic bankruptcy. The fake, glittering kingdom Beatrice had sacrificed everything to build was burning to the ground, and her own elite guests were eagerly running away from the flames. As our security phalanx neared the main entrance of the grand ballroom, a new sharp sound sliced cleanly through the heavy velvet curtains covering the massive front windows. It started as a faint, distant wail echoing through the cool Atlanta night air, but it rapidly grew louder, more urgent, and entirely unmistakable. Police sirens, multiple police sirens screaming down the winding, manicured driveway of the exclusive country club, heading straight for the main entrance. The sudden, terrifying noise instantly killed the screaming match taking place on the dance floor. Darius's loud defensive shouting abruptly stopped, replaced by a horrifying, suffocating silence. The reality of my father's ruthless efficiency had finally arrived. The white-collar crime division of the FBI did not waste a single second when a billionaire handed them a perfectly documented, comprehensive portfolio of undeniable wire fraud. They were coming for Darius, and they were coming right now. I heard the loud, unmistakable clatter of Darius's rented leather shoes as he desperately tried to sprint toward the rear kitchen exit, his cowardly instinct driving him to flee like a rat abandoning a sinking ship. But the heavy, relentless wail of the approaching sirens confirmed that the building was already entirely surrounded. There was absolutely nowhere left for him to hide. His fake, arrogant empire had officially reached its miserable, inevitable conclusion. The two lead security guards pushed the heavy mahogany doors wide open. The crisp, refreshing chill of the evening air washed over my face, instantly cleansing my lungs of the heavy, suffocating perfume and the toxic, desperate energy of the ballroom. We stepped out of the venue and onto the grand, sweeping stone portico. The circular valet driveway was bathed in the harsh, flashing red and blue lights of 3 arriving police cruisers and 2 unmarked black SUVs. Uniformed officers and federal agents were already pouring out of the vehicles, their faces stern and deeply serious, marching briskly toward the club entrance to execute the immediate arrest of Darius Vance. They respectfully parted to allow our heavily guarded procession to pass. Recognizing the sterling security detail and understanding exactly who had orchestrated the sudden raid. Parked precisely at the bottom of the grand stone steps, idling quietly with absolute intimidating power, was my father's custom, armored black Rolls-Royce Phantom. The driver, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, immediately opened the heavy, reinforced rear door, standing at rigid attention. My father stepped forward, gently settling a still sleeping Zuri onto the plush, luxurious leather seating. My mother slid into the car next, her posture remaining flawlessly elegant, her expression radiating a deep, satisfying calm. I stood on the pavement for one final, fleeting second. I took a deep breath of the clean, cool night air. The screaming, the chaos, and the financial ruin of the Vance family were entirely contained within the brick walls behind me. I did not look back at the building. I simply stepped forward into the secure, quiet, and deeply comforting sanctuary of the armored vehicle. The driver firmly shut the heavy door, instantly cutting off the noise of the sirens and the chaotic reality of my former life. As the heavy armored Rolls-Royce smoothly glided away from the crowded curb, carrying me toward my new absolute freedom, I looked down at my beautiful, peaceful daughter. She was finally completely safe, completely surrounded by true, undeniable power, and entirely free from the dark, toxic shadows forever. 6 months have passed since that spectacular night in the ballroom. The cold winter air that swept through the country club doors has long since given way to the warm, vibrant embrace of a southern spring. Our lives have transformed in ways that are as profound as they are beautiful. When I look at Zuri now, I no longer see the terrified, shivering little girl who was banished to a folding chair by the public restrooms. I see a radiant, confident child who knows exactly how much she is deeply and unconditionally loved. She spends her weekends riding horses on my parents' sprawling estate, her joyful laughter echoing across the pristine rolling hills. My father, the ruthless corporate titan who dismantled an entire family with a single phone call, spends hours sitting patiently at a tiny plastic table, happily drinking imaginary tea with his granddaughter. My mother, Vivian, the undisputed queen of Atlanta high society, proudly wears the slightly lopsided hand-painted macaroni necklaces Zuri makes for her, wearing them to high-profile board meetings without a single ounce of shame. Zuri still wears her sustainable handmade linen dresses, but now she wears them like absolute armor, completely untouched by the cruel, superficial judgments of insecure people. She is safe, she is cherished, and she is entirely free from the toxic environment that sought to crush her bright spirit. My own professional life has experienced a massive, unprecedented resurrection. For 6 years, I kept my philanthropic efforts intentionally small, operating my children's education nonprofit on a shoestring budget to avoid drawing any unwanted attention from Andre's status-obsessed family. I hid my resources, downplayed my connections, and pretended to be an ordinary, struggling director just to make my husband feel like the primary financial provider. That miserable charade is officially over forever. With my true identity no longer a secret, the Sterling Family Trust publicly and aggressively threw its massive financial weight behind my organization. We did not just expand our operations. We completely revolutionized the educational landscape of the entire city. We opened 5 new community centers in underserved neighborhoods, fully funded by my family capital. I no longer sit quietly in the back of cramped conference rooms, waiting for arrogant men to grant me permission to speak. I walk into executive boardrooms under my maiden name, Maya Sterling, and I command the absolute respect of every single person sitting at the table. The very same financial institutions that previously ignored my modest grant applications now aggressively bid for the privilege of partnering with my foundation. They understand that crossing me means crossing the Sterling Empire, and nobody with a functioning brain is willing to make that catastrophic mistake. While my world has expanded into a beautiful realm of limitless possibility, the Vance family has been violently compressed into a miserable, suffocating reality of their own meticulous design. The swift, merciless justice my parents promised that night at the country club was executed with absolute surgical precision. Darius never even made it back to his heavily mortgaged luxury penthouse. The federal agents waiting in the valet driveway arrested him on the spot, publicly marching him out of the resort in gleaming silver handcuffs, while the local news cameras, tipped off by my father's incredibly efficient public relations team, captured every humiliating second. Darius was denied bail due to his severe flight risk and the overwhelming mountain of forensic evidence stacked heavily against him. 2 months ago, he was convicted of multiple counts of federal wire fraud and sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. He traded his rented Lamborghini and his fake alpha male persona for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit and a cold concrete cell. Tasha experienced a catastrophic downfall that was equally satisfying to witness from afar. When the federal authorities seized Darius' frozen accounts, they also seized every single asset tied to his fraudulent enterprise. Tasha was immediately evicted from her towering penthouse apartment. The luxury car dealership repossessed her vehicle right out of the building parking garage. Desperate to maintain her fake bougie lifestyle, she attempted to pivot into becoming a lifestyle influencer, posting tearful, highly edited videos, claiming she was the innocent victim of a massive corporate conspiracy. The internet, however, is completely unforgiving. Her comment sections were flooded by the very same socialites who had witnessed her horrific behavior at the birthday party. They ruthlessly exposed her rented jewelry, her fake designer bags, and her profound cruelty toward a 6-year-old child. Utterly disgraced and entirely bankrupt, Tasha now lives in a tiny, cramped studio apartment on the outskirts of the city, working as a junior sales associate at a discount cosmetics kiosk in a dying shopping mall. Beatrice, the arrogant matriarch who proudly declared that chickens cannot stand with peacocks, was thoroughly plucked of every single feather. My mother, true to her chilling promise, refused to yield a single inch regarding the $50,000 country club invoice. Beatrice was entirely incapable of paying the massive debt. My family holding company aggressively pursued the collection, placing a devastating lien on her suburban home. Her house was officially foreclosed upon and sold at a public auction to the highest bidder. Stripped of her home, her country club membership, and her fragile social standing, Beatrice became a complete pariah in Atlanta society. The wealthy women she had desperately tried to impress permanently blocked her phone number. She currently rents a small, dingy basement apartment and works as a night shift receptionist at a budget motel, forced to physically serve the very working-class people she spent her entire miserable life looking down upon. And then there is Andre, the man who cowardly chose a fake leased lifestyle over the emotional safety of his loyal wife and innocent child. His termination from his prestigious financial firm was absolute and irreversible. Once the senior partners realized he had lost the Sterling family backing, he was treated like toxic waste. Word travels incredibly fast in the Southern Financial District, and Andre was completely blacklisted from every legitimate corporate institution in the state. Stripped of his high salary and his manufactured corporate identity, Andre currently works as a commission-based retail employee, selling cheap, poorly tailored suits at a mid-level department store in a strip mall. His lawyer attempted to reach out to Harrison once, desperately begging for a modest alimony settlement to keep Andre from completely drowning in his mounting debts. Harrison responded by sending a single legally binding cease and desist order, threatening to countersue for years of emotional distress and financial mismanagement. Andre never reached out again. He spends his long days measuring inseams and folding cheap polyester shirts, completely haunted by the agonizing, inescapable knowledge that he held a beautiful, loving, incredibly wealthy family right in his bare hands, and he threw it all away to impress a convicted felon. When I look back on that agonizing 6-year marriage, I realize that the most valuable lesson I learned had absolutely nothing to do with money. Society constantly tries to tell us that wealth is defined by the designer labels on your clothing, the expensive cars parked in your driveway, or the exclusive invitations you receive to elite social events. Beatrice, Tasha, and Andre worshipped at the altar of that fake superficial prosperity. They spent their entire lives desperately chasing a hollow illusion, entirely willing to sacrifice their basic human decency, their family loyalty, and their moral compass, just to appear successful to absolute strangers. True wealth is not loud. True wealth does not need to scream for attention or tear down innocent children to validate its own existence. True wealth is having the ultimate power to dictate exactly who is allowed to sit at your table. It is the absolute, unshakable peace of mind that comes from knowing your child is safe, loved, and entirely protected from toxic influences. It is the quiet, formidable strength required to firmly establish your personal boundaries and ruthlessly enforce them when malicious people attempt to cross the line. The Sterling legacy is not just a massive financial empire. It is a profound standard of respect, integrity, and uncompromising familial loyalty. I had to walk through the absolute darkest, most humiliating shadows to remember my own fundamental worth. But I emerged from those ashes completely unbroken. I chose to protect my daughter, and in doing so, I ultimately saved myself from a lifetime of misery. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I know there are so many people out there currently dealing with toxic, manipulative family members who constantly belittle your achievements and mock your lifestyle choices. I want you to know that your value is absolutely never determined by their profound insecurity or their shallow judgments. Please let me know in the comments section down below where you are watching this video from today. I genuinely love reading about where my audience is located around the world. If you have ever had to boldly stand up to a toxic family member, establish ironclad boundaries, and forcefully remove yourself from a deeply unhealthy environment, please hit the like button right now and subscribe to the channel for more stories about resilience, karmic justice, and finding your ultimate freedom. Remember, you have the absolute power to rewrite your own narrative. Never let anyone make you feel like you belong in the shadows. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you all in the very next video.